In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hide behind every rose bush, a single breath can unravel a web of deceit. Imagine a cryptic letter slipping into Miss Jane Marple's hands, its words chilling. Beware the sly fox in the council's fold. One breath will unmask the betrayer. Who is the traitor lurking among the trusted parish council? Is it the nervous vicar clutching a locked drawer's secret? Or the sharp-tongued treasurer, her ledger hiding more than numbers? As Miss Marple, with her unassuming charm and razor-sharp mind, sips tea and knits, she's already untangling a scheme of stolen funds and whispered conspiracies. From a coded receipt to a stranger's arrival at the inn, each clue pulls her closer to a shocking betrayal. Will a single fleeting moment, a breath expose the cunning fox before the village crumbles? In 10 gripping chapters, follow Miss Marple as she navigates tense meetings, midnight rendezvous, and a gala where masks slip, leading to a final, satisfying unmasking that restores St. Mary Mead's peace. Dive into a tale of suspense where every glance, every word, and one crucial breath holds the key to truth. Chapter 1. The Whisper in St. Mary Mead. The morning sun draped its golden light over St. Mary Mead, a village so quaint it seemed to have stepped out of a postcard, with its thatched cottages, blooming hedgerows, and the gentle hum of routine. Miss Jane Marple, a slight figure with a deceptively mild demeanor, sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, flickered occasionally to the world beyond her roses, where the village stirred with its usual rhythm. It was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays in St. Mary Mead were predictable market stalls by the square, the postman's bicycle rattling along the lanes, and the faint clatter of teacups from neighboring homes. But this Tuesday something was amiss. Postman young Tommy Pierce pedaled up to her gate, his freckled face flushed from the morning's rounds. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, handing her a small bundle of letters. "Bit of a queer one in there today. No return address." "Thank you, Tommy," she replied, her voice gentle, but her gaze lingering on the boy's uneasy expression. Tommy was not one for nerves, yet his fingers twitched as he handed over the bundle. She tucked the observation away, as she did with all the small details that others overlooked. The letters were ordinary enough bills, a note from her nephew, Raymond, an invitation to the church fete, but one envelope stood out. It was plain, slightly creased, with her name scrawled in a hurried hand. No stamp, no postmark, just Miss J. Marple in bold ink. She slid it open with a silver letter opener, her movements precise. Inside was a single sheet, the words typed. In a stark, mechanical font, "Beware the sly fox in the council's fold. Trust is a luxury St. Mary Mead can ill afford. One breath will unmask the betrayEr. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, not in alarm but in curiosity. The note was cryptic, theatrical even, but it carried a weight of intent. A sly fox in the parish council? The council was a small, fussy group. Mr. Clements, the vicar, Mrs. Price, the treasurer, Dr. Haydock, and a handful of others who bickered over flower shows and charity drives. Betrayal was a strong word, implying deceit deeper than village gossip. She folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, her mind already turning over possibilities. The phrase "one breath" intrigued her, most vague, yet oddly specific, like a clue waiting to be deciphered. The parish council meeting was that evening, a fortnightly affair in the church hall. Miss Marple decided to attend, not as a member. She had no patience for their endless debates, but as an observer, a role at which she excelled. She donned her best hat, a sensible navy affair with a single feather, and walked the short distance to the hall, her steps light but purposeful. The air was crisp, scented with late summer roses and the faint tang of wood smoke. Villagers nodded. As she passed, their smiles warm but fleeting, unaware of the puzzle she carried. The church hall was a modest space, its walls lined with faded posters for past fetes and harvest suppers. A long table dominated the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs where the council sat, their voices already rising in familiar squabbles. Mr. Clements, the vicar, presided with a weary air, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he called for order. Mrs. Price, a sharp-featured woman with tightly pinned hair, clutched a ledger as if it were a shield. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, leaned back with a wry smile, while Mrs. Babcock, the florist, prattled about the upcoming chrysanthemum show. Others, Mr. Grayson, the butcher, Miss Hartnell, the spinster, filled out the group. Each with their quirks and grudges. Miss Marple slipped into a chair at the back, her knitting in her lap, her presence barely noticed. She listened as they debated the Fates budget, her eyes moving from face to face. Mr. Clements seemed distracted, his fingers drumming on the table. Mrs. Price's voice was clipped, her responses to questions about funds oddly curt. When Dr. Haydock asked about a recent donation from the Women's Institute. Mrs. Price hesitated, flipping through her ledger before muttering about clerical errors. Miss Marple's needles paused. Clerical errors were rare in St. Mary Mead, where every penny was scrutinized. As the meeting droned on, Miss Marple's gaze settled on a small interaction. Mrs. Price leaned toward Mr. Clements, whispering something that made his face tighten. He nodded once, sharply, and she sat back, her lips pressed thin. It was a fleeting moment, but to Miss Marple it was as loud as a shout. Something was afoot, and the note's warning echoed in her mind. She stayed until the meeting ended, her knitting untouched, her thoughts weaving a pattern of suspicion. On her way home, she stopped by the post office to chat with Mrs. Blades, the postmistress, whose knack for gossip rivaled Miss Marple's own. "Queer thing, that letter," Miss Marple said casually, describing it without revealing its contents. Mrs. Blades frowned. "No stamp, you say? Sounds like someone dropped it straight in the box." "Tommy might have seen who." Miss Marple nodded, her plan forming. She found Tommy later, kicking stones by the village green. "Tommy," she said, offering a peppermint from her bag, "did you notice anyone near the postbox yesterday evening?" Tommy, his mouth full, thought hard. "Dunno, miss. It was dark when I collected the post, but maybe someone was by the hedge. Heard a rustle, like someone scarperin' off." "A rustle," she repeated, her tone encouraging. Tommy shrugged, but his words were enough. Someone had taken pains to deliver the note unseen, suggesting fear or cunning. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and reread the letter. The sly fox could be anyone on the council, but Mrs. Price's guarded demeanor and the vicar's unease stood out. She recalled a similar case years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a churchwarden's oversight hid a small theft. People, she mused, were predictable in their flaws. The next day, She visited the church under the guise of arranging flowers for Sunday service. Mr. Clements was there, polishing the brass lectern with a distracted air. "Good morning, Vicar," she said brightly. "The council meeting was lively last night," he started, nearly dropping his cloth. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple, the usual squabbles. Nothing serious." "Nothing serious?" she echoed, her tone mild. "I thought Mrs. Price seemed rather protective of her ledger." The vicar's eyes flickered to the vestry door, where a small desk held his papers. "She's meticulous," he said quickly. "A fine treasurer." Miss Marple smiled, noting the locked drawer on the desk. "Of course. It's good to have trust in one's colleagues." She left him to his polishing, her suspicion confirmed. The vicar was nervous, and that drawer held something he didn't want seen. Over the next few days, Miss Marple observed the village with renewed focus. She chatted with Mrs. Babcock about the fete, learning that donations were up this year, yet Mrs. Price had claimed otherwise. She overheard Mr. Grayson grumble about delayed payments for meat supplied to the fete. Small discrepancies, perhaps, but they pointed to a pattern. The note's warning of a sly fox suggested someone was manipulating funds, and Mrs. Price, with her ledger, was the obvious suspect. Yet the vicar's behavior gnawed at her. Why was he so tense? Was he complicit or merely aware of something amiss? On Saturday, Miss Marple attended a WI meeting where Mrs. Price gave a report on the fate's finances. Her figures were precise, but when questioned about a missing £50 donation, she flushed and blamed a bookkeeping error. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her tea, noticed Mrs. Price's hand slip into her pocket, as if checking something. Later, as the women dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, pretending to adjust her hat. She saw Mrs. Price drop a small slip of paper into the donation box, a curious act for a treasurer. That evening, Miss Marple enlisted Dolly Bantry, her friend and confidant, to help retrieve the slip under the pretense of checking the box's lock. The paper was a receipt not for a donation, but for a cash transfer, written in a code of letters and numbers. "How odd," Miss Marple said, tucking it away. "This isn't the usual sort of thing one finds in a donation box." Dolly, ever eager for intrigue, leaned in. "Do you think it's fraud, Jane?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that someone is being very clever, but not clever enough." She spent the night studying the receipt, its code elusive but familiar, like the shorthand used by her old friend Clara in her banking days. It hinted at a transaction, perhaps to an outside account. The sly fox was careful, but the note's author, whoever they were, had seen through the deception. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the council again. Mrs. Price was the obvious culprit, but the vicar's locked drawer suggested he knew more than he let on. And who had sent the note? An insider, perhaps, or someone watching closely. The chapter closed with Miss Marple in her armchair, the coded receipt on her lap, the letter beside it. She had no proof yet, only threads of suspicion, but threads were enough to begin weaving. The church fete was in 2 days, a perfect opportunity to watch the council in action. She would attend, her eyes sharp, her manner unassuming, ready to catch the sly fox in a moment of weakness. The village slept, but Miss Marple's mind was alight, piecing together the puzzle of St. Mary Mead's betrayal. Chapter 2. The hidden ledger. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, sat in her cozy parlor in St. Mary Mead, her mind far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. The village still buzzed with whispers of the sapphire brooches, theft at the charity gala, and though the constable had dismissed it as a simple crime, Miss Marple's sharp eyes had caught details others missed. The smudge of rouge on a guest's glove, the maid's nervous glance, small threads in a tapestry of deceit she was determined to unravel. Today she resolved to visit Harrow Manor, where the gala had been held, under the guise of discussing Lady Harrow's prized roses. Her true aim was to probe deeper into the mystery, sensing the brooch's disappearance was tied to secrets far weightier than a stolen jewel. The morning was crisp, with a light mist clinging to the hedgerows as Miss Marple walked the short path to the manor. Her black handbag, ever present, swung lightly at her side, and her sensible shoes crunched on the gravel. Harrow Manor loomed ahead, its ivy-clad walls and tall windows exuding an air of faded grandeur. Lady Harrow, a tall woman with a penchant for dramatic hats, greeted her warmly at the door. "Miss Marple, how delightful! Come to admire my roses, have you?" she said, her voice bright but tinged with the strain of recent events. "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "Your garden is the talk of the village, and I couldn't resist a closer look." As they strolled toward the rose beds, Miss Marple's gaze swept the grounds, noting the study window where the brooch had last been seen. The glass was slightly ajar, a detail the constable had overlooked. She filed it away, her mind already turning over possibilities. The rose garden was a riot of color, with blooms in shades of crimson, blush, and ivory. Lady Harrow gestured proudly at a cluster of hybrid teas. "These are my pride and joy," she said, snipping a wilted bud, "though I dare say the gala has overshadowed them. Such a scandal, that brooch vanishing under our noses." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes catching a glint of metal near the study door, half hidden by a lavender bush. "Dreadful, isn't it?" she murmured. "One wonders who could have slipped in unnoticed. So many guests, and all so preoccupied." She let the word hang, watching Lady Harrow's face for a reaction. The hostess's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, launching into a tale of her newest rose variety dot. As they circled the garden, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the gala's attendees. "Such a distinguished crowd," she remarked. "The Earl, of course, and that charming heiress, Miss Clara. And wasn't there a solicitor present? A Mr. Grayson, I believe?" Lady Harrow's fingers tightened on her pruning shears. "Oh, yes, Mr. Grayson, always hovering about the Earl, muttering about investments. Dull man, really." Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her voice. The mention of the Earl and Grayson together seemed to unsettle her. They paused near the study door, where Miss Marple bent to admire a low-growing rose, her eyes scanning the ground. There in the soft earth was a chipped lockpick, its tip bent as if used clumsily. She straightened, her expression unchanged, but her mind raced. A professional thief would hardly leave such a clue. This suggested an amateur, someone desperate or inexperienced. "What a lovely spot," she said, gesturing vaguely at the roses. "You must keep the study locked with such treasures inside." Lady Harrow laughed a touch too loudly. "Oh, the study's more my husband's domain. Old papers, dusty ledgers, nothing of interest. But her eyes darted to the window, and Miss Marple noted the lie. The study, she was certain, held more. Then dusty papers dot as they returned to the house for tea. Miss Marple overheard a heated exchange from an open window above. The Earl's voice, sharp with anger, cut through the air. "That ledger must be found, Grayson. If it falls into the wrong hands, we're ruined." The solicitor's reply was too low to catch, but the urgency in the Earl's tone confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The brooch was no mere trinket. It was tied to something far more valuable, a ledger, perhaps, that held secrets worth stealing. In the drawing-room, Lady Harrow poured tea, her hands steady, but her chatter a fraction too bright. Miss Marple sipped her Darjeeling, her mind piecing together fragments. The Earl's financial troubles were no secret in the village. Whispers of unpaid debts and a failing estate had circulated for months. The ledger, she reasoned, might detail those troubles, or worse, something incriminating. The brooch's theft could be a distraction, a way to cover the ledger's disappearance. To test her theory, Miss Marple turned the conversation to the manor's history. "Such a grand old place," she said, her tone wistful. "I imagine it's full of secrets, hidden runes, perhaps, or forgotten papers." Lady Harrow laughed, but her eyes flickered. "Oh, nothing so romantic. Just creaky floors and endless repairs. Though the study does have its share of old documents. My husband's forever sorting through them." Miss Marple smiled, noting the evasion. "How tedious for him," she said. "I suppose the butler helps? Such a reliable man, your Mr. Finch." The mention of the butler seemed to catch Lady Harrow off guard. "Finch? Oh, yes, he's been with us for years. Knows every corner of the manor." Her voice was tight, and Miss Marple sensed an opportunity. After tea, she excused herself to the powder room, taking a deliberate detour past the study. The door was ajar, and the butler, Finch, was inside, polishing a desk. His movements were precise, but his eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple approached. "Good afternoon, Mr. Finch," she said brightly. "Such a lovely desk. Mahogany, isn't it? I imagine it holds all sorts of important papers." Finch's polishing cloth paused. "Just the usual, ma'am," he said, his tone guarded. "Bills, letters, that sort of thing." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning. The room, a row of books caught her attention, one slightly askew. Behind it she glimpsed a torn scrap of paper, its edge marked with ink. "You must have your hands full with the gala and all. So many guests, and such chaos. I heard the Earl mention a ledger, something about the manor's finances." Finch's face paled, but he recovered quickly. "Can't say I know anything about that, ma'am. I just keep the place tidy." His fingers tightened on the cloth, and Miss Marple smiled, sensing his discomfort. Back in the garden, she lingered by the lavender bush, retrieving the chipped lockpick with a handkerchief. It was crude, likely fashioned from a hairpin or wire, suggesting someone unused to such work. The maid, perhaps, or someone posing as a guest. Her thoughts turned to the Earl, whose financial woes were no secret, and the solicitor, Grayson, whose name kept surfacing. The ledger, she was certain, was the key to the brooch's theft. That evening, Miss Marple attended a village whist drive, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, leaned close, her voice low. "They say the Earl's in deep with creditors," she whispered. Sold off half his land already, and now that brooch gone missing. Makes you wonder. Miss Marple nodded, her expression vague, but her ears sharp. Another villager mentioned seeing Grayson at the manor late at night, carrying a briefcase. Looked nervous, he did, the man said, like he was hiding something. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple slipped away to the manor's guest wing, where coats from the gala still hung in a cloakroom. Pretending to adjust her shawl, she examined the garments, her fingers brushing a man's overcoat. Tucked in its pocket was a torn page, its edges matching the scrap she'd seen in the study. The page bore numbers, debts, perhaps, or transactions, and a single word, brooch. Her heart quickened, but her face remained serene. The coat belonged to Grayson, she was sure, his initials embroidered on the lining. The ledger, the brooch, the Earl's debts, it was all connected, and Grayson was at the heart of it. But why steal the brooch? Was it to sell or to hide what the ledger revealed? Miss Marple returned home, her mind a whirl of connections. The chipped lockpick suggested an amateur, yet Grayson's involvement pointed to calculation. The maid's nervous glance at the gala replayed in her mind. Had she seen something or done something? And what of the rouge-smudged glove? It belonged to Clara, the heiress, whose charm masked a certain uneased dot as she settled by her fire, knitting in hand. Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The torn ledger page was a solid clue, linking Grayson to the manor's secrets. She would trace its owner further, perhaps by engaging Clara or revisiting Finch. The brooch's theft was no simple crime. It was a thread in a larger web, one she would unravel with her usual patience. For now she was content to let the village sleep, unaware of the sharp mind piecing together its shadows. The next day Miss Marple rose early, her plan clear. She would return to the manor, perhaps to inquire about a lost handkerchief, and keep her eyes open for more signs of the ledger. Grayson's role was evident, but the maid, Clara, and even Finch warranted watching. The lockpick, the torn page, the Earl's anger, there were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to see the whole picture. As she sipped her tea, gazing out at the misty village, she felt the familiar thrill of a mystery unfolding, her quiet demeanor hiding a mind as sharp as ever. The manor was quiet when she arrived, the morning sun casting long shadows across the lawn. Lady Harrow was out, but Finch admitted her, his expression wary. "Just looking for a handkerchief I might have left," Miss Marple said, her tone apologetic. "I do hate to be a bother." "No bother, ma'am," Finch said, though his eyes followed her closely. She wandered toward the cloakroom, pausing to admire a portrait of the Earl's father, whose stern face seemed to watch her. The cloakroom was dim, the coats undisturbed. Since the gala, she checked Grayson's coat again, finding nothing new, but a woman's shawl caught her eye. Clara's, by its embroidered initials. A faint scent of rouge clung to it, and Miss Marple's lips pursed. The glove, the shawl, Clara was involved, but how? As she left the cloakroom, she heard a creak from the study. Finch was there, rearranging papers, but his movements were hurried. "Finding everything in order, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice mild. He started, dropping a pen. "Just tidying, ma'am." "Nothing out of the ordinary?" "Of course," she said, her eyes catching a glimpse of a locked drawer in the desk. "Such a busy household. I imagine you see all sorts of comings and goings." Finch muttered something non-committal, and Miss Marple smiled, retreating to the hall. The locked drawer nagged at her. If the ledger was hidden, it might be there or already gone. She needed to speak to Clara, whose unease at the gala suggested more than idle nerves. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Clara for tea at her cottage, framing it as a chance to discuss village charities. Clara arrived, her glamorous air tempered by a slight pallor. "So kind of you to invite me," she said, her smile tight. "St. Mary Mead is charming, but rather quiet after London." "Oh, we have our excitements," Miss Marple said, pouring tea. "The gala, for instance. Such a pity about the brooch. You were there, weren't you? So many people, it must have been hard to keep track." Clara's cup rattled in its saucer. "Yes, quite a crowd. I barely noticed anything, really." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not even a nervous maid or a gentleman with a briefcase? I do find people so fascinating, don't you?" Clara's laugh was brittle. "I suppose so, but I'm afraid I'm not much for noticing details." They chatted on, but Miss Marple's gentle probing yielded little more. Clara's unease was palpable, though, and when she left, Miss Marple noticed a small sketchbook in her handbag, its edge visible as she adjusted her shawl. Was it like the one in the study with the torn page? That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village settle into dusk. The ledger was the key, she was certain, but its contents remained elusive. Grayson's involvement, Clara's nerves, the maid's glance, the chipped lockpick, they formed a pattern, but not yet a picture. She resolved to visit the vicarage tomorrow, where village records might shed light on the manor's finances. For now she was content with her progress, the torn page a tangible step toward the truth. The next morning she called on the vicar, who was sorting parish accounts. "Such a lot of history in these old books," she said, peering at a dusty ledger. "I don't suppose you have anything on the manor's old deeds? I'm ever so curious about its past." The vicar, eager to please, pulled out a volume from the 1800s. "Not much, I'm afraid," he said. "But there's mention of a trust tied to the Earl's family, something about a sapphire heirloom. Odd, isn't it, with the brooch stolen?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Very odd," she agreed, scanning the page. The trust mentioned a ledger kept in the manor's study, detailing payments to a mysterious beneficiary. Was this what Grayson sought? And why steal the brooch if the ledger was the prize? As she left the vicarage, she passed the manors gates, where a delivery boy was handing a parcel to Finch. The butler's hands shook slightly, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to the lockpick. Was Finch more than a bystander? She smiled to herself, her steps light despite the weight of her thoughts. The ledger's secrets were close, and with them the truth of the brooch's theft. For now, she would watch, listen, and wait, her quiet presence a trap for the unwary. The day unfolded with small revelations. At the village shop, Mrs. Price mentioned seeing Grayson arguing with a stranger near the station, a man with a scarred hand. "Looked like trouble," she said. Miss Marple nodded, her mind adding the stranger to her web of clues. Was he a buyer for the brooch, or another player in Grayson's scheme? By evening she returned to the manor, this time with Mrs. Bantry, who was eager to discuss the harvest festival. As they chatted in the hall, Miss Marple's eyes strayed to the study door, now locked. She excused herself, citing a need for fresh air, and slipped into the garden. The lavender bush was undisturbed, but nearby she found a fresh footprint, too large for the maid's. Grayson's or the strangers? Back home, she lit her fire and resumed her knitting, her thoughts racing. The ledger, the brooch, the Earl's debts, Clara's nerves, Finch's unease, the chipped lockpick, the torn page, the stranger's scar, they were threads in a complex weave. She was close, she knew, to unraveling it. Tomorrow she would press Finch further, perhaps with a question about the study's locked drawer. For now she was satisfied, the torn page a beacon guiding her toward the truth dot as the village slept. Miss Marple's mind worked on, piecing together the shadows of St. Mary Mead. The ledger's secrets, she sensed, would reveal not just the thief, but a deeper betrayal. Her needles clicked, a steady rhythm against the night, as she waited for the next piece to fall into place. Chapter 2. The Vicar's Hesitant Confession. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat with her tea. The cryptic letter from the previous day lay open beside her, its words still sharp in her mind, a sly fox among the parish council. She sipped her Earl Grey, her thoughts as orderly as the neatly trimmed roses outside her window. The parish council meeting had revealed little outright, but the air had been thick with unspoken tensions, shifty glances, forced smiles, and that curious discrepancy in the ledger she'd glimpsed in Mrs. Price's hands. It was a small sum, barely noticeable, but Miss Marple knew that small sums often hid larger secrets. She set her teacup down and adjusted her spectacles, her mind already mapping the village's web of connections. St. Mary Mead was a quiet place, but its stillness was deceptive, like a pond hiding currents beneath its surface. The council members were familiar faces: Mr. Clements, the vicar, with his earnest sermons; Mrs. Price, the treasurer, with her meticulous ledgers; and a handful of others, each with their quirks and histories. But a betrayer? That was a word that carried weight, and Miss Marple was not one to dismiss it lightly. Her plan was simple. Start with the vicar. Mr. Clements was a man of the cloth, but even men of the cloth could falter. His nervous demeanor at the meeting, the way his fingers had fidgeted with his collar when Mrs. Price spoke of the budget, had not escaped her notice. She would visit him under the guise of discussing the upcoming church fete, a perfect excuse to probe without raising suspicion. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and selected a modest hat from the rack by the door. The vicarage was a short walk past the village green where children played, and the postmistress, Mrs. Baker, swept her stoop. The air was crisp, scented with autumn leaves and the faint smoke of a distant bonfire. As she walked, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the familiar paths, noting the small details that others might overlook: a new curtain in Mrs. Price's window, a bicycle propped against the inn that hadn't been there yesterday. Details, she knew, were the threads that wove the truth. The vicarage stood at the edge of the village, a sturdy stone building with ivy creeping up its walls. Miss Marple knocked, and the door was opened by Mrs. Clements, a plump woman with a perpetually flustered air. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a pleasure," she said, ushering her inside. "Harold's in his study, fretting over his sermon, as usual. Would you like tea?" "No, thank you, Mrs. Clements," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "I've just had mine. I was hoping to speak with the vicar about the fete. I do so want to help with the arrangements." Mrs. Clements beamed. "You're too kind, Miss Marple. He'll be delighted. Go right through." The study was a small, cluttered room, its shelves lined with theological tomes and hymnals. Mr. Clements sat at his desk, his thin frame hunched over a notebook, his pen scratching furiously. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his eyes momentarily startled before he composed himself. "Miss Marple," he said, standing. "What a pleasant surprise. Please sit." She settled into a worn armchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I won't keep you long, Mr. Clements. I was thinking about the fete, such a lovely tradition. I wondered if you'd settled on the charities to support this year." The vicar's smile was tight, his fingers brushing the edge of his desk. "Oh, we're still discussing that. The council, you know, has many opinions. Mrs. Price is very particular about the accounts." "Mrs. Price does keep things in order," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "I noticed. Her ledger at the meeting, such meticulous work, though I did wonder about a small entry, something about a donation that seemed unclear." Mr. Clements's hand paused, hovering over a stack of papers. "A donation?" he said, his voice a touch too high. "I'm sure it's all in order. Mrs. Price is very thorough." "Of course," Miss Marple said, tilting her head, "but even the most thorough among us can miss a detail. I once knew a treasurer in St. Mary Mead, years ago, who overlooked a small sum, and it turned out to be quite the tangle. A misunderstanding, of course, but it caused such a stir." The vicar's face paled slightly, and he reached for his teacup, though it was empty. "I'm sure there's no such tangle here," he said quickly. "The council's funds are modest, but we manage." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Naturally. Though I did wonder about that locked drawer of yours." She gestured toward the desk, where a small brass keyhole gleamed in the morning light. "Important papers, I presume?" Mr. Clements's hand twitched as if to cover the drawer. "Just personal notes, sermons, you know, nothing of interest." Of course," Miss Marple said, rising. "Well, I mustn't keep you. Do let me know how I can help with the fete. Perhaps I could assist with the donation collection." Yes, that would be lovely," the vicar said, his relief palpable as he stood to see her outdot. As Miss Marple stepped into the hall, she caught sight of a photograph on the mantel, a younger Mr. Clements, standing beside a man she didn't recognize, both in clerical robes. The stranger's face was stern, his eyes sharp. She made a mental note to inquire about him later. Outside, the village was stirring. Miss Marple paused by the green, where young Tommy, the paper boy, was tossing a ball with his friends. She waved him over, her smile warm. "Tommy, you're out early today, keeping busy?" "Always, Miss Marple," he said, grinning. "Got to deliver the papers before school." "You must see all sorts of things on your rounds," she said casually. "I suppose you notice when folks are up late, burning the midnight oil?" Tommy's eyes lit up, eager to share. "Oh, sure. Like the vicar the other night. I saw him in the churchyard, burning papers in that old metal bin. Looked right sneaky, he did." "Burning papers?" Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "How?" "Curious. Perhaps old sermons?" "Maybe," Tommy said, shrugging. "But it was awful late, past midnight." "Thank you, Tommy," she said, slipping him a shilling. "You're a sharp lad." As she walked home, Miss Marple's mind churned. The vicar's nervousness, the locked drawer, the burned papers had all pointed to something hidden. But what? Mr. Clements was not a cunning man, but he was anxious, and anxious men often knew more than they let on. She would need to dig deeper, perhaps through the village's older records or a quiet word with someone who knew the vicar's past. Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair, pulling out her knitting. The click of the needles was soothing, a rhythm that let her thoughts wander. She recalled a similar case years ago, when a village treasurer had burned receipts to cover a debt. The vicar wasn't burning receipts, surely, but papers held secrets, and secrets had a way of surfacing in St. Mary Mead. The afternoon passed quietly, but Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. She decided to visit the church later, under the pretense of arranging flowers for the altar. The churchyard where Tommy had seen the vicar might hold clues, a scrap of paper, perhaps, or a trace of ash. She also resolved to speak with Mrs. Baker, the postmistress, who knew everyone's business and might recall something about the vicar's early days in the village. By evening, Miss Marple was ready. She donned her coat and scarf, her steps purposeful as she headed to the church. The village was hushed, the sky a deep indigo streaked with clouds. The churchyard was empty, the metal bin Tommy had mentioned tucked behind a yew tree. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the ground. A faint smell of ash lingered, but the bin was empty, its contents swept away by the wind or a careful hand. She moved to the church door, which creaked open under her touch. Inside, the air was cool, scented with wax and old wood. The altar flowers were wilting, giving her a plausible reason to linger. As she arranged a fresh bouquet, her eyes darted to the vestry door, where the parish records were kept. The vicar's study was nearby, and that locked drawer nagged at her thoughts. A sudden noise, a soft thud from the vestry made her pause. She set down the flowers and moved silently toward the sound. The vestry door was ajar, and through the crack she saw a shadow moving. Her heart quickened, but she remained still, her years of quiet observation serving her well. The shadow resolved into the vicar, his face pale in the dim light, fumbling with a stack of papers. He glanced around, then slipped them into the locked drawer, turning the key with a trembling hand. Miss Marple retreated to the altar, her mind racing. The vicar was hiding something, but was he the sly fox or merely a pawn? She needed more, perhaps. A glimpse at those papers, or a clue to what had been burned. As she left the church, the night air was sharp, and a single star pierced the clouds. She felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle taking shape, each piece a step closer to the truth. Back home, she lit a fire and settled with her notebook, jotting down her observations, the vicar's nerves, the locked drawer, the burned papers, Tommy's story. She also noted the photograph in the vicarage, the stern-faced stranger who might hold a key to the vicar's past. Tomorrow she would visit Mrs. Baker and inquire about Mr. Clements's early years in St. Mary Mead. She might also check the parish records if she could find a way to do so discreetly. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to human nature. The vicar was a good man, but good men could be swayed by fear, by loyalty, by secrets. She had seen it before, in St. Mary Mead and beyond. The sly fox was close, she was sure, and she would find them, one careful step at a time. Chapter 3. The treasurer's hidden past. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the window. The soft light of the late morning filtering through the lace curtains of her cottage in St. Mary Mead. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a quiet counterpoint to the thoughts swirling in her mind. The cryptic letter, now tucked safely in her writing desk, had set her on a path of quiet investigation. Its words, a sly fox among the parish council, had lodged themselves in her thoughts like a burr, and the subtle discrepancies she'd noticed in the council ledger during the meeting only deepened her curiosity. The vicar, Mr. Clements, had been nervous, his hands fidgeting, when questioned about the accounts, but Miss Marple's instincts told her the trail might lead elsewhere. Her gaze drifted to the garden where the roses were in full bloom, but her mind was fixed on Mrs. Price, the parish council's treasurer, whose guarded demeanor at the meeting had not escaped her notice. Mrs. Price, or Margaret as she was known, to the village, was a woman of middle age, with sharp features and a penchant for sensible tweed skirts. She had moved to St. Mary Mead some 5 years prior, arriving with little fanfare but a reputation for efficiency. Her role as treasurer suited her meticulous nature, and the village had come to rely on her for balancing the books of everything, from the church fete to the parish hall repairs. Yet there was something about her, a certain wariness in her eyes, a tightness in her smile that Miss Marple found intriguing. It was the kind of look she had seen before in people who carried secrets they hoped to bury in the quiet rhythm of village life. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. The best way to understand Mrs. Price, she decided, was to begin with the village's most reliable source of information, the postmistress, Mrs. Weatherby. The post office was the heart of St. Mary Mead's gossip, a place where letters and parcels passed through alongside whispers of scandal and snippets of history. If anyone knew about Mrs. Price's past, it would be Mrs. Weatherby, whose memory for village lore was as sharp as her stamp-canceling hand. The walk to the post office was pleasant, the summer air warm and fragrant with the scent of freshly cut grass. St. Mary Mead was at its loveliest in July, with cottages draped in climbing roses and children playing in the lanes. Miss Marple nodded to passers-by. Mrs. Bantry, hurrying to the butcher's. Young Tommy, the paper boy, pedaling furiously on his bicycle, had made her way to the small stone building that housed the post office. Inside, the air was cool, and the counter was cluttered with parcels and envelopes, all neatly sorted by Mrs. Weatherby's practiced hands. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Weatherby said, peering over her spectacles. Her round face was framed by a halo of gray curls, and her eyes sparkled with the anticipation of a chat. "What brings you here today? Not another parcel for your nephew, I hope?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression as mild as ever. "No parcels. Today, Mrs. Weatherby, I was hoping to have a word about the church fete. I understand Mrs. Price has been quite the help with the accounts." Mrs. Weatherby's eyebrows rose, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, Margaret Price? She's a marvel with numbers, isn't she? Never a penny out of place, or so they say. Though, mind you, she's not one to talk much about herself. Keeps her cards closed, that one." Miss Marple nodded, as if only mildly. "Curious. She's been with us a few years now, hasn't she? I seem to recall she came from London. Quite a change, moving to a little place like St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes gleamed. "Oh, yes, London. She doesn't talk about it, but I heard, mind you. This was years ago, before you and I ever met her, that there was some trouble there, Nothing proven, of course, but they say she left in a hurry. Something about money, or so the gossip went. My cousin in Clapham wrote to me about it, you know. She said Margaret Price was mixed up in some business with a charity, and there were questions about the funds. Never charged, mind, but people do talk. Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but her mind was alight. A scandal involving money, even an unproven one, was precisely the kind of thread she needed to tug. "How interesting," she murmured. "I suppose people often come to villages like ours to start afresh. And she's done so well here, hasn't she?" Mrs. Weatherby nodded vigorously. "Oh, she has. Never a complaint about her work. Though, if you ask me, she's a bit too private. Always polite, but you never really know what she's thinking. Not like the rest of us who wear our hearts on our sleeves." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Weatherby and left the post office, her steps slow and thoughtful. The whisper of a scandal in London was a promising lead, but she needed more than gossip. She needed facts, and facts were often found in the small, overlooked details of daily life. Her next stop, she decided, would be the church fete, where Mrs. Price would be handling the cash box. There was no better place to observe someone's habits than when they were distracted by the bustle of a village event. The fete was held on the village green, a cheerful affair with bunting strung between trees and stalls laden with homemade jams, knitted scarves, and second-hand books. Children darted about, clutching toffee apples, while the adults milled around, exchanging pleasantries. And coins. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed and a sensible hat, blended into the crowd, her sharp eyes scanning for Mrs. Price. She found her at the main stall, counting donations with a brisk efficiency that bordered on mechanical. Her hands moved, quickly sorting coins and notes into neat piles, but there was a tension in her posture, a slight rigidity that suggested she was aware of being watched. Miss Marple approached, offering a warm smile. "Mrs. Price, you've outdone yourself this year. The fete looks splendid, and I hear the donations are quite generous." Mrs. Price looked up, her smile polite but guarded. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's all for the church roof, you know. Every penny counts." "Indeed it does," Miss Marple said, her tone light. She lingered at the stall, pretending to examine a jar of chutney while watching Mrs. Price's hands. There it was, a subtle movement, almost imperceptible. As Mrs. Price counted a stack of pound notes, she slipped one into the pocket of her apron, her fingers moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. It was a small act, easily dismissed as a mistake, but Miss Marple knew better. Small acts, repeated, could add up to something significant. The day wore on, and Miss Marple made a point of circling back to the stall several times, always with a pretext, a question about the raffle, a compliment on the organization. Each time she noted Mrs. Price's careful handling of the cash, the way her eyes darted to the crowd, as if checking for onlookers. By late afternoon, when the fete was winding down, Miss Marple volunteered to help tidy the donation box, a task that allowed her to examine its contents closely. Among the crumpled notes and coins, she found a folded receipt, its edges worn as if it had been handled often. The writing was in code, a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing at first glance, but Miss Marple slipped it into her handbag, her heart quickening with the thrill of discovery. Back at her cottage, she spread the receipt on her writing desk, her magnifying glass in hand. The code was simple, a substitution cipher she recognized from her days helping her nephew, Raymond, with his amateur sleuthing. It took her an hour, working by lamplight, to decipher it. The result was a name harrow and a date 3 weeks. Hence, alongside a sum of money, £500. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting forgotten. The name Harrow was unfamiliar, but the sum was significant, far more than the petty cash Mrs. Price might have skimmed from the fete. This was no small theft. It was part of a larger scheme, one that reached beyond the village. Her thoughts turned to the parish council's accounts, which she had glimpsed at the meeting. The discrepancy she'd noticed, a few pounds here, a few there, had seemed minor, but now she wondered if it was the tip of something larger. Mrs. Price's past, with its whispers of embezzlement, suggested a pattern. Had she come to St. Mary Mead to escape her history, only to fall back into old habits? Or was she working with someone else, someone who knew her weaknesses and exploited them? Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage again, this time with a more direct approach. She would not confront Mrs. Price yet, that would be premature, but she could press Mr. Clements for more information about the council's finances. The vicar, she suspected, was not the mastermind, but a man caught in a web he didn't fully understand. His nervous demeanor and the locked drawer in his study suggested he was hiding something, perhaps out of fear rather than guilt. The next morning she arrived at the vicarage with a basket of homemade scones, a pretext for a friendly visit. Mr. Clements welcomed her, though his smile was strained and his hands trembled slightly as he poured tea. They sat in his study, a cozy room lined with books and papers, the locked drawer in his desk catching Miss Marple's eye. "I do hope the fate's proceeds will help with the church roof," she said, her tone conversational. "Mrs. Price seems to have everything under control, doesn't she?" Mr. Clements nodded, his eyes flickering to the desk. "Oh, yes, Margaret is very capable. The accounts are always in order." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze soft but probing. It must be a relief to have someone so reliable. Though, I suppose, with so many donations coming in, it's easy to lose track of a few pounds here and there. The vicar's teacup rattled in its saucer. "Lose track? Oh, no, I don't think so. Margaret is very thorough." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "But I did hear years ago about some trouble in London, nothing serious, I'm sure, just gossip. It's remarkable how people can start anew, isn't it?" Mr. Clements paled, his fingers tightening around his cup. "London? I wouldn't know about that. Margaret has always been exemplary here." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind was racing. The vicar knew something, perhaps not the full extent of Mrs. Price's actions, but enough to make him uneasy. She changed the subject, chatting about the weather and the upcoming harvest festival, but her eyes never strayed far from the locked drawer. When she left the vicarage, she was certain of two things. Mrs. Price was involved in something underhanded, and Mr. Clements was either complicit or too frightened to act dot. Over the next few days, Miss Marple pursued her inquiries with her usual discretion. She spoke to old Mrs. Harmon, who remembered a rumor about Mrs. Price's sudden departure from London after a charity's funds went missing. She visited the village hall, where the council's records were kept, and, under the guise of helping with the filing, examined the ledgers more closely. The discrepancies were there, small but consistent, always tied to charity drives or fetes, where Mrs. Price handled the cash. The amounts were never large enough to draw attention, but over time they added up to hundreds of pounds. The coded receipt remained her most tantalizing clue. The name Harrow nagged at her, unfamiliar yet significant. Was it a person, a place, or a code for something else? She recalled the vicar's mention of a new member of the parish council, a man named Harrow, who had yet to attend a meeting. Could he be connected? Or was it a coincidence, a red herring meant to mislead? As the week drew to a close, Miss Marple attended the Sunday service, her eyes on Mrs. Price, who sat in the front pew, her face composed but her hands restless. The vicar's sermon was on trust, a topic that seemed to make Mrs. Price shift uncomfortably. After the service, Miss Marple lingered, watching as Mrs. Price slipped into the vestry, presumably to count the collection plate. On impulse, Miss Marple followed, pausing outside the door to listen. She heard the clink of coins, the rustle of paper, and then a soft gasp, as if Mrs. Price had been startled. Peering through the crack in the door, Miss Marple saw Mrs. Price slip another note into her pocket, her movements quick and furtive. But this time she dropped something, a small, folded piece of paper, identical in size to the coded receipt. Miss Marple waited until Mrs. Price left, then retrieved the paper, her heart pounding. It was another coded message, this one mentioning a meeting at the churchyard set for midnight the following night. Miss Marple returned home, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The churchyard meeting suggested a conspiracy, one that involved Mrs. Price and possibly this mysterious Harrow. The coded receipts, the missing funds, the vicar's unease all pointed to a scheme that was both calculated and concealed. She sat by her fire, the coded paper in her hand, and began to decipher it, her needles lying idle. The message confirmed the meeting and mentioned a final sum to be delivered. It was enough to convince her that Mrs. Price was not acting alone, but who was pulling the strings? The chapter closed with Miss Marple in her garden, the coded receipt tucked into her pocket, her eyes on the distant church spire. The mystery had deepened, its threads weaving through the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. She knew she was close to uncovering the truth, but the sly fox remained elusive, hidden in plain sight. With a quiet resolve, she planned her next move, determined to attend the midnight meeting and see who or what awaited in the shadows. Chapter 4. The stranger at the inn. The late summer sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the cobblestone paths and thatched roofs. Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking softly as she contemplated the cryptic threads of the mystery unfolding in her quiet village. The parish council's subtle tensions, the vicar's nervous demeanor, and Mrs. Price's guarded handling of the fate's funds had stirred her curiosity, but it was the arrival of a newcomer that morning that sharpened her focus. A man named Mr. Harrow had checked into the Blue Boar Inn, and the village was already abuzz with whispers about the charming stranger. Miss Marple, ever cautious of polished exteriors, resolved to learn more about him. She set her knitting aside and adjusted her shawl, her sharp eyes scanning the garden gate, as if expecting a clue to stroll through it. The village was small, its rhythms predictable, and strangers were rare enough to warrant attention. Mr. Harrow, she'd heard from Mrs. Bantry's maid, had arrived with a single leather suitcase, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed a touch too fine for a man claiming to be a writer researching rural life. His manners, the maid had gushed, were ever so refined, and he'd already won over the innkeeper with tales of his travels. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Refinement, she knew, could mask many things. She decided to visit the Blue, bore herself, under the guise of delivering a basket of preserves to Mrs. Margetson, the innkeeper's wife. The walk to the inn was pleasant, the air thick with the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass. St. Mary Mead's High Street was quiet, save for the occasional clatter of a bicycle or the chatter of children playing near the village green. As she approached the inn, its ivy-clad walls and diamond-paned windows gleamed in the sunlight, a picture of rustic charm. Yet Miss Marple's mind was far from the idyllic scene. She was thinking of ledgers, discrepancies, and the sly fox mentioned in the anonymous letter. Inside the Blue Boar, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished wood and ale. Mrs. Margetson, a stout woman with a perpetually flushed face, greeted Miss Marple warmly. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to bring these!" she exclaimed, taking the basket of preserves. "You must stay for a cup of tea. We've a new guest, you know, Mr. Harrow. Such a gentleman." Miss Marple smiled demurely. "So I've heard. A writer, is he? I should like to meet him. I've always been fond of a good story." Mrs. Margetson, eager to show off her distinguished guest, led Miss Marple to the parlor, where Mr. Harrow sat by the window, a notebook open before him. He was a man of about 40, with dark hair slicked back and a neatly trimmed mustache. His suit, though elegant, was slightly worn at the cuffs, a detail Miss Marple noted immediately. He rose as she entered, his smile broad and practiced. "Miss Marple, I presume?" he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "Mrs. Margetson has told me of your reputation as the village's most astute observer." Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes twinkling with a mix of amusement and scrutiny. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who enjoys a bit of gossip, Mr. Harrow. And you, I hear, are a writer. What brings you to St. Mary Mead?" He gestured to the notebook. "Inspiration, Miss Marple. I'm working on a book about the heart of England's villages, their traditions, their people, their secrets." His eyes lingered on her for a moment as if gauging her reaction. "Secrets?" she said lightly, settling into a chair. "St. Mary Mead is a quiet place. I'm not sure we have many of those." He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "Every village has its shadows, Miss Marple. It's the writer's job to find them." They chatted for a while, Miss Marple steering the conversation with the skill of a seasoned angler. She asked about his travels, his methods of research, and his interest in the parish council, which she mentioned casually as a pillar of village life. Mr. Harrow's answers were polished but vague, and she noticed his fingers tighten slightly on his pen when she mentioned Mrs. Price, the treasurer. It was a fleeting gesture, but Miss Marple had spent decades observing such subtleties dot as they spoke. Mrs. Margetson bustled in with tea, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to study Mr. Harrow's belongings. A leather satchel rested against his chair, its flap slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of papers and a fountain pen. On the table beside him lay a handkerchief, its corner embroidered with a monogram, J.H. The initials didn't match Harrow, she assumed, was not his real name, or at least not the one tied to the handkerchief. She filed the observation away, her mind already spinning possibilities. "Tell me, Mr. Harrow," she said, sipping her tea, "do you find our little council meetings worth your research? They can be rather dull, I'm afraid." He leaned back, his smile unwavering. "Oh, I find them fascinating. The dynamics of power, even in a small village, are quite revealing. Mrs. Price, for instance, she seems a woman of considerable influence." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "Does she? I suppose she does handle the council's finances with great care. A heavy responsibility, don't you think?" "Indeed," he said, his tone neutral but his gaze sharp. "A position that requires absolute trust." The conversation drifted to safer topics, village history, the upcoming gala, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Mr. Harrow's interest in Mrs. Price was too pointed, his questions too deliberate. She resolved to keep an eye on him, and as she left the inn, she thanked Mrs. Margetson warmly, promising to return soon. That evening, Miss Marple attended a knitting circle at the vicarage, a perfect excuse to observe the village's pulse. The room was filled with the soft chatter of women, their needles clacking rhythmically. Mrs. Price was there, her face composed but her hands fidgeting with her yarn. Miss Marple, seated nearby, made small talk, carefully probing about the council's recent activities. Mrs. Price's answers were curt, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone dot as the evening wore on. Miss Marple excused herself to fetch a glass of water, taking the opportunity to pass by the vicar's study. The door was ajar, and she glimpsed Mr. Harrow inside, speaking in low tones to Mr. Clements. Their voices were too soft to discern, but the vicar's posture hunched. Anxious confirmed her suspicions. Mr. Harrow was no mere observer. He was involved, perhaps deeply, in whatever scheme was afoot. Back at home, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. She thought of the handkerchief, the monogram, and Mr. Harrow's keen interest in Mrs. Price. The village was a tapestry of secrets, and he was a new thread, one that didn't quite match the pattern. She decided to visit the inn again, this time with a plan to learn more about his belongings. The next morning she enlisted the help of young Tommy, the paper boy who was always eager for a shilling and a bit of adventure, under the pretense of delivering a parcel to Mrs. Margetson. Miss Marple sent Tommy to the inn with instructions to keep his eyes open. He returned an hour later, breathless with news. "Miss Marple, I saw something odd," he whispered, his eyes wide. "Mr. Harrow's room, it's full of books, but not the kind you'd expect. They're ledgers, like the ones my dad keeps for his shop. And there was a letter on his desk, half open with a funny seal on it." "A seal?" Miss Marple asked, her interest piqued. "What did it look like?" "Like a fox, ma'am." "A sly-looking fox." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The anonymous letter had mentioned a sly fox, and now this. She thanked Tommy, slipping him a shilling, and sat back to think. Mr. Harrow's room, filled with ledgers, suggested he was more than a writer. A conman, perhaps, or an investigator, with his own agenda. The fox seal was a clue, one she would pursue. Over the next few days, Miss Marple made a point of crossing paths with Mr. Harrow. She invited him to tea, where she gently probed his knowledge of village history, noting his evasive answers about his own past. She observed him at the village shop, where he purchased a notebook with cash, his hands steady, but his eyes scanning the room. She even contrived to bump into him near the church, where he lingered by the notice board, studying the councils. Announcements each encounter added to her picture of the man. He was charming, yes, but calculated, his every word chosen with care. His interest in Mrs. Price grew more apparent. He asked about her habits, her role in the fete, and her connections in the village. Miss Marple, ever the picture of innocence, answered vaguely, watching his reactions. Once, as they parted, he dropped his handkerchief again, and she retrieved it, noting the same J.H. monogram. She returned it with a smile, but her mind was racing. On the fourth day, Miss Marple devised a bolder plan. Mrs. Margetson, ever obliging, had mentioned that Mr. Harrow often left his room unlocked while he took his morning walk. Seizing the opportunity, Miss Marple visited the inn under the guise of borrowing a recipe book. While Mrs. Margetson rummaged in the kitchen, Miss Marple slipped upstairs, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. She found Mr. Harrow's room, its door indeed ajar, and stepped inside. The room was tidy, almost too perfect. The bed was made, the desk orderly, but the ledgers Tommy had mentioned were stacked neatly on a shelf. She opened one, her fingers trembling slightly, and found pages filled with numbers, dates, and initials, some matching Mrs. Price's, others unfamiliar. A letter, tucked between the pages, bore the fox seal Tommy had described. It was addressed to a Mr. J. Hartwell, with instructions to secure the funds before the gala. The name Hartwell confirmed her suspicions. Harrow was an alias. She heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly replaced the letter, slipping out of the room just as Mrs. Margetson called her name. Back in the parlor, she maintained her composure, chatting about recipes while her mind churned. Mr. Harrow or Hartwell was no writer. He was here for the council's funds, and Mrs. Price was either his accomplice or his target. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The sly fox was not just a metaphor, it was a symbol, perhaps, of a larger scheme. Mr. Harrow's ledgers, the fox seal, and his interest in Mrs. Price pointed to a calculated plan, one that likely involved the parish council's money. But why St. Mary Mead, and how did the vicar fit in? She thought of the locked drawer in Mr. Clement's study, the burned papers Tommy had seen. The vicar was hiding something, but whether he was a victim or a participant remained unclear. As the sun set, casting long shadows across her roses, Miss Marple made a decision. She would attend the next council meeting where Mr. Harrow had promised to appear as a guest. There she would watch him closely, looking for the slip that would reveal his true intentions. She picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their steady rhythm, but her mind was far from idle. The stranger at the inn was a piece of the puzzle, and she was determined to place him. The chapter closed with Miss Marple glancing at the sky, the first stars appearing. She felt a quiet thrill, the kind that came with unraveling a mystery. Mr. Harrow thought himself clever, but he had yet to meet the full measure of an old spinster's sharpness. The game, she knew, was only beginning. Chapter 5. The Midnight Meeting. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a silver glow across the village's cobblestone paths and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles idle in her lap. Sleep had eluded her tonight, her mind buzzing with the threads of suspicion she'd begun to weave. The cryptic letter, the vicar's nervous glances, Mrs. Price's guarded demeanor, and the enigmatic Mr. Harrow, all pieces of a puzzle that refused to settle into place. She gazed out at the quiet village, her sharp eyes catching the faintest flicker of movement near the churchyard. A shadow darted between the yew trees, swift and deliberate. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. She set her knitting aside, slipped on her soft house shoes, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The clock on her mantel read midnight. No respectable soul would be wandering the churchyard at this hour, she thought. Her curiosity, honed by years of observing human nature's subtleties, propelled her forward. She moved quietly, her steps light despite her age. The night air was cool, scented with damp earth and blooming roses from her garden. The church loomed ahead, its ancient stone walls bathed in moonlight, the spire piercing the starry sky. Miss Marple kept to the shadows, her small frame blending with the hedgerows lining the path. She paused behind a gnarled oak, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the figure again, a man, she judged by the silhouette, slipping through the churchyard gate. Cautiously she followed, her breath steady, but her senses alert. The figure moved toward the far corner of the churchyard, where the oldest graves lay, half hidden by ivy and moss. There, beneath the shelter of a towering yew, another shadow joined the first. Miss Marple crouched low, her knees protesting faintly, and strained to hear. The voices were hushed, urgent, carrying the weight of secrecy. "Must be done soon," the first voice said, low and clipped. "The deadline's approaching. If we don't act, it'll all unravel." Miss Marple tilted her head, her ears attuned to every nuance. The voice was unfamiliar, not the vicar's soft tenor or Mr. Harrow's polished drawl. Yet there was something distinctive in its cadence, a slight hesitation, as if the speaker weighed each word. "We can't rush this," the second voice replied, sharper, with a hint of impatience. "Clement is already asking questions." "He's not as dim as he seems," Miss Marple's lips pursed. Clements, the vicar. So he was entangled in this, whatever this was. She edged closer, careful not to rustle the leaves underfoot. The moon slid behind a cloud, plunging the churchyard into deeper shadow, and she used the moment to creep within earshot, hiding behind a weathered gravestone. The first voice spoke again, softer now. "The plan's solid, but we need the final piece. The ledger's locked away, and only she has the key." "Mrs. Price won't talk," the second voice said with confidence. "She's in too deep. She knows what's at stake." Miss Marple's mind raced. Mrs. Price, the treasurer with her guarded smiles and meticulous ledgers. The mention of a key piqued her interest further. Could it be the locked drawer in the vicar's study, or something else entirely? She leaned forward, her shawl catching on a twig. She froze, but the snap was faint, swallowed by the night's stillness. The voices paused. Miss Marple held her breath, her heart a steady drum in her chest. After a moment the conversation resumed, but the speakers had lowered their voices to a near whisper. She caught only fragments. Charity drive. Next week, Harrow's pushing too hard. Before the second voice hissed, "Someone's here." Miss Marple pressed herself against the gravestone, her small frame tucked into its shadow. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path, moving away from her. She waited, counting silently to 10, then peered out. The figures had vanished, swallowed by the darkness beyond the churchyard. She exhaled, her mind already sifting through what she'd heard. A plan, a deadline, a ledger, and a key. And Mr. Harrow's name, spoken with a mix of irritation and caution. As she rose, something glinted in the grass at her feet. She bent down, her fingers brushing against cold metal. A key, small and ornate, lay half-hidden in the dew-soaked grass. She picked it up, turning it over in her hand. It was no ordinary house key. Its intricate design suggested something older, perhaps tied to the church itself. Miss Marple slipped it into her pocket, her thoughts whirling. This was no coincidence. The key was a clue, dropped in haste by one of the conspirators. She retraced her steps, moving swiftly but silently back to her cottage. The village was still, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl. Inside, she locked her door and placed the key on her writing desk, studying it under the soft glow of her lamp. It was brass, worn smooth in places, with a clover-shaped bow that hinted at craftsmanship from decades past. She knew the church's records were kept in a locked cabinet in the vestry, a relic from the days when St. Mary Mead's parish was wealthier and more cautious. Could this be the key to those records? Miss Marple sat back, her mind weaving connections. The cryptic letter had mentioned a sly fox among the parish council, the vicar's nervous behavior, Mrs. Price's hidden past, and now this midnight meeting all pointed to a scheme centered on the council's funds. Mr. Harrow, with his charming facade and pointed questions, was clearly more than a writer, passing through. But who was the second figure? And why the urgency of a deadline? She opened her notebook, a small, leather-bound volume she kept for such occasions, and jotted down her observations. The vicar's name had come up, but not Mrs. Price's, which was curious. If Mrs. Price held the key literal or figurative, why wasn't she at the meeting? Miss Marple tapped her pencil against the page, recalling the village gossip about Mrs. Price's London scandal. Embezzlement, the postmistress had said, hushed and scandalized. Could she be repeating old habits? Or was she a pawn in a larger game? The clock chimed 1, and Miss Marple closed her notebook. She would need to tread carefully. The key in her pocket was a tangible lead, but she couldn't march into the church and start unlocking cabinets without arousing suspicion. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit the church under the guise of arranging flowers for Sunday's service. It was a plausible excuse, one that would allow her to inspect the vestry without drawing attention. She extinguished the lamp and returned to her window, gazing out at the now quiet churchyard. The moon had emerged, bathing the village in a serene glow, but Miss Marple knew serenity was an illusion in St. Mary Mead. Beneath its quaint surface, secrets festered, and she was determined to root them out. She patted the key in her pocket, a small smile playing on her lips. The betrayer, whoever they were, had made their first mistake, and Miss Jane Marple never overlooked a mistake. The next morning St. Mary Mead awoke to a bustle of activity. The village fete was approaching, and preparations were in full swing. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, made her way to the church, a basket of roses and dahlias tucked under her arm. The vicar, Mr. Clements, was outside, directing a group of volunteers as they set up tables for the fete. He looked pale, his eyes darting nervously as he spotted her. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a touch too bright. "Come to lend a hand with the flowers?" "Indeed, Mr. Clements," she replied, her tone warm but her eyes sharp. "The altar deserves a bit of cheer, don't you think?" He nodded, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Yes, yes, of course. The vestry's open if you need vases." Miss Marple smiled, noting the slight tremor in his hand. She entered the church, the cool air a contrast to the warm September sun outside. The vestry was a small room off the main nave, cluttered with hymnals, candlesticks, and a heavy oak cabinet that dominated one wall. She set her basket down and glanced at the cabinet's lock. It was old, like the key in her pocket, with a similar ornate design. She worked quickly, arranging the flowers while keeping an ear out for footsteps. The church was quiet, save for the distant chatter of volunteers. She slipped the key from her pocket and approached the cabinet, her heart steady but her senses alert. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click, and the door creaked. Open. Inside were stacks of papers, parish records, baptismal registers, and, tucked at the back, a slim ledger bound in black leather dot. Miss Marple opened it, her eyes scanning the neat rows of figures. The entries were meticulous, detailing donations, expenses, and charity disbursements, but something was off. Certain sums, small but consistent, didn't add up. Donations from the annual fete, the Christmas bazaar, and other events were recorded, but the totals were slightly lower than she remembered from past years. She flipped to a page marked with a red ribbon and found a list of initials Mem, P, J, H, and a third she couldn't decipher next to amounts that matched no known village. Fund. She closed the ledger, her mind racing. Name P could be Mrs. Price, and J.H. likely stood for Mr. Harrow. But who was the third party? And why were these funds unaccounted for? She locked the cabinet and returned to her flowers, her thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. The vicar's fear, the midnight meeting, the key, it all pointed to a carefully orchestrated scheme, but the mastermind remained elusive. As she left the church, she passed Mrs. Price, who was overseeing the fate's cash box. The treasurer's smile was tight, her eyes lingering on Miss Marple a moment too long. Miss Marple nodded politely, her own expression serene. She knew. Better than to confront anyone yet. The pieces were falling into place, but she needed more proof, not just suspicion. Back at her cottage, she sat in her armchair, the key now resting on her tea table. The ledger had confirmed her suspicions of financial tampering, but the scope was larger than she'd imagined. The charity drives, the church funds, the fete, all were being siphoned, bit by bit, in a way that would go unnoticed by anyone less observant than herself. She thought of Mr. Harrow, his charming smile and probing questions. He was no mere writer, that much was clear. But was he the sly fox of the letter, or merely a cog in a larger machine? The afternoon passed in quiet reflection. Miss Marple attended the fete, her eyes and ears open. She chatted with villagers, her questions innocuous but pointed. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, mentioned seeing Mr. Harrow lingering near the church late at night, though she thought he was merely admiring the architecture. Young Tommy, the paper boy, confided that he'd seen the vicar burning papers in the churchyard, just as he'd told her before. Each tidbit added to the tapestry, but the full picture remained just out of reach. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned. Home, the key a comforting weight in her pocket. She lit her lamp and opened her notebook, adding new details, the ledger's discrepancies, The initials, the midnight meeting's cryptic words. The deadline, she mused, was key. Something was set to happen soon, perhaps at the fete or shortly after. She would need to act quickly, but with the utmost care. A false move could alert the conspirators, and she had no intention of letting them slip away. She leaned back, her eyes drifting to the window. The church spire stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, a silent sentinel over St. Mary Mead's secrets. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the key, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow she would dig deeper into the ledger, into Mr. Harrow's true identity, into the heart of the betrayal. For now she was content to let the village sleep, unaware of the storm she was about to unleash. The days leading to the fete were a blur of activity, but Miss Marple moved through them with quiet purpose. She visited the church daily, ostensibly to tend the flowers, but each visit allowed her to study the vestry, the cabinet, and the ledger. She memorized key dates and figures, cross-referencing them with village records she borrowed from the postmistress under the guise of historical curiosity. The discrepancies grew clearer. Small sums, siphoned from each major event, funneled into an account marked only by those cryptic initials. She also kept an eye on Mr. Harrow. He was everywhere at the fete preparations, offering help with a smile that never reached his eyes. She noticed how he lingered near Mrs. Price, their exchanges brief but tense. Once she saw him slip a note into her hand, too quick for anyone else to notice. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. Were they partners, or was one manipulating the other? The vicar, meanwhile, grew more agitated. At a council meeting, he fumbled through his report on the fate's budget, his eyes darting to Mrs. Price as if seeking reassurance. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the back, noted every gesture. Mr. Clements was no mastermind, she decided. He was caught in something, perhaps blackmailed or coerced. His fear was genuine, but his role remained unclear. On the eve of the fete, Miss Marple sat in her garden, the key now a familiar talisman. She thought of the midnight meeting, replaying the voices in her mind. The second speaker's confidence, the mention of a deadline, the absence of Mrs. Price's name, it all suggested a hierarchy. Mr. Harrow, with his polished charm and hidden ledgers, was likely at the center, but the unknown voice hinted it. Someone else, someone pulling strings from the shadows. She considered her next move. The fate would be chaotic, the perfect cover for whatever plan the conspirators had. She would need to be there, watching, listening, ready to act. The key had unlocked one secret, but others remained. Who was the third set of initials? What was the deadline? And how deep did the betrayal run? As the sun set, casting long shadows across her garden, Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill. The village might see her as a harmless spinster, but she was a hunter in her own way, tracking not foxes but human frailties. The sly fox was out there, and she was closing in. The fate, she knew, would be the turning point. She patted the key, her smile faint but resolute. The betrayer's time was running out. As she left the church, she passed Mrs. Price, who was overseeing the fate's cash box. The treasurer's smile was tight, her eyes lingering on Miss Marple a moment too long. Miss Marple nodded politely, her own expression serene. She knew. Better than to confront anyone yet. The pieces were falling into place, but she needed more proof, not just suspicion. Back at her cottage, she sat in her armchair, the key now resting on her tea table. The ledger had confirmed her suspicions of financial tampering, but the scope was larger than she'd imagined. The charity drives, the church funds, the fate, all were being siphoned, bit by bit, in a way that would go unnoticed by anyone less observant than herself. She thought of Mr. Harrow, his charming smile and probing questions. He was no mere writer, that much was clear. But was he the sly fox of the letter, or merely a cog in a larger machine? The afternoon passed in quiet reflection. Miss Marple attended the fete, her eyes and ears open. She chatted with villagers, her questions innocuous but pointed. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, mentioned seeing Mr. Harrow lingering near the church late at night, though she thought he was merely admiring the architecture. Young Tommy, the paper boy, confided that he'd seen the vicar burning papers in the churchyard, just as he'd told her before. Each tidbit added to the tapestry, but the full picture remained just out of reach. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned. Home, the key a comforting weight in her pocket. She lit her lamp and opened her notebook, adding new details, the ledger's discrepancies, the initials, the midnight meeting's cryptic words. The deadline, she mused, was key. Something was set to happen soon, perhaps at the fete or shortly after. She would need to act quickly, but with the utmost care. A false move could alert the conspirators, and she had no intention of letting them slip away. She leaned back, her eyes drifting to the window. The church spire stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, a silent sentinel over St. Mary Mead's secrets. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the key, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow she would dig deeper into the ledger, into Mr. Harrow's true identity, into the heart of the betrayal. For now she was content to let the village sleep, unaware of the storm she was about to unleash. The days leading to the fete were a blur of activity, but Miss Marple moved through them with quiet purpose. She visited the church daily, ostensibly to tend the flowers, but each visit allowed her to study the vestry, the cabinet, and the ledger. She memorized key dates and figures, cross-referencing them with village records she borrowed from the postmistress under the guise of historical curiosity. The discrepancies grew clearer. Small sums siphoned from each major event, funneled into an account marked only by those cryptic initials. She also kept an eye on Mr. Harrow. He was everywhere at the fete preparations, offering help with a smile that never reached his eyes. She noticed how he lingered near Mrs. Price, their exchanges brief but tense. Once she saw him slip a note into her hand, too quick for anyone else to notice. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. Were they partners, or was one manipulating the other? The vicar, meanwhile, grew more agitated. At a council meeting, he fumbled through his report on the fate's budget, his eyes darting to Mrs. Price as if seeking reassurance. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the back, noted every gesture. Mr. Clements was no mastermind, she decided. He was caught in something, perhaps blackmailed or coerced. His fear was genuine, but his role remained unclear. On the eve of the fete, Miss Marple sat in her garden, the key now a familiar talisman. She thought of the midnight meeting, replaying the voices in her mind. The second speaker's confidence, the mention of a deadline, the absence of Mrs. Price's name, it all suggested a hierarchy. Mr. Harrow, with his polished charm and hidden ledgers, was likely at the center, but the unknown voice hinted it. Someone else, someone pulling strings from the shadows. She considered her next move. The fate would be chaotic, the perfect cover for whatever plan the conspirators had. She would need to be there, watching, listening, ready to act. The key had unlocked one secret, but others remained. Who was the third set of initials? What was the deadline? And how deep did the betrayal run? As the sun set, casting long shadows across her garden, Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill. The village might see her as a harmless spinster, but she was a hunter in her own way, tracking not foxes but human frailties. The sly fox was out there, and she was closing in. The fate, she knew, would be the turning point. She patted the key, her smile faint but resolute. The betrayer's time was running out. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spread the ledger's pages across her table, her knitting abandoned in favor of a pencil and notepad. She listed the initials, the dates, the amounts, searching for a pattern. The discrepancies were clever, spread across multiple events to avoid suspicion, but they followed a rhythm, always during busy occasions, always involving cash, always with J.H. or E.P. attached. She tapped her pencil against the table, her mind drifting to her nephew Raymond's stories of financial scams in London. The clever ones, he had said, hide in plain sight, using trust as their shield. Trust, that was the key. The village trusted Mrs. Price with its money, Mr. Clements with its soul, and Mr. Harrow with his charm. But trust, Miss Marple knew, was a fragile thing, easily exploited. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Bantry, whose gardener had once siphoned funds from a charity drive, his small thefts unnoticed, until a single misplaced receipt betrayed him. This was no different, only larger, more calculated. She spent the afternoon cross-referencing the ledger with her own notes on village events, her memory sharp despite her age. The flower show of 23, the Christmas bazaar of 24, the orphans' fund last spring all had been tampered with. The amounts were small, but over time they could total hundreds of pounds, enough to tempt even the most cautious betrayer. She paused on an entry from the previous summer, a donation of £20, recorded as 15, with a note J.H. to L. London again, or perhaps a person. She needed to know more about Mr. Harrow's past, his true identity. The evening brought a soft rain pattering against her windows. As she sat by the fire, the ledger open before her. She thought of the midnight meeting, the hushed voices, the dropped key. Mr. Harrow had been there, she was certain, but who was the other? The voice had been too soft to identify, but its urgency suggested fear or greed. She considered confronting Mrs. Price, but that would be premature. The treasurer was cautious, her London scandal proof of her ability to cover her tracks. Mr. Harrow, with his ledgers and questions, was the more immediate thread to pull. She rose, her decision made. Tomorrow she would visit the inn, under the guise of borrowing a book from Mr. Harrow's supposed research. She would watch him, listen to him, and let his own words betray him. The ledger, for now, would remain her secret, its pages a map to the truth. She closed it carefully, tucking it into a drawer beneath her knitting, and turned her attention to the fire. The village of St. Mary Mead slept, its secrets buried but not forgotten, and Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve, was determined to unearth them. The next day dawned bright, the rain having cleared to leave the village sparkling. Under a pale sun, Miss Marple dressed with care, choosing a simple hat and her best gloves, her appearance unassuming, but her mind razor-sharp. The inn was a short walk, its sign creaking gently in the breeze. Mr. Harrow was in the parlor, his typewriter clattering as he worked on his book. He looked up as she entered, his smile as polished as ever. "Miss Marple," he said, rising. "What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the visit?" "Oh, nothing important," she said, her tone light. "I heard you were researching village life, and I thought you might have some books on local history. I'm rather fond of it myself." His eyes flickered, but his smile held. "Of course. I have a few volumes upstairs. Would you like me to fetch them?" "No need to trouble yourself," she said quickly. "Perhaps I could see your collection? I'm sure it's fascinating." He hesitated just for a moment, then nodded. "Certainly, follow me." They climbed the narrow stairs to his room, where books and papers were neatly arranged, or so it seemed. Miss Marple's eyes darted to a stack of ledgers in the corner, their covers identical to the one in her drawer. She kept her expression neutral, asking about a book on the shelf while noting the monogrammed handkerchief on his desk. The same monogram she had seen before. J.H., she thought. John Harrow, perhaps, or something else entirely. They chatted for a while, Miss Marple steering the conversation to the parish council, the fete, the donations. Mr. Harrow was careful, his answers smooth but vague, his eyes never quite meeting hers. She mentioned the church's records, watching for a reaction, but he only smiled and changed the subject. It was enough, though. His composure was too perfect, too practiced. She left the inn with a borrowed book she had no intention of reading, her mind buzzing. The ledgers in his room, the monogram, the initials in the hidden ledger, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was close to seeing its shape. She returned home, her steps slower now, her thoughts heavy with the weight of what she had uncovered. The ledger's secrets were clear. Funds were being siphoned, methodically, cleverly, by someone who knew the village's trust could be exploited, but the mastermind remained elusive. Was it Harrow with his charm and hidden ledgers? Mrs. Price, with her past and her access to the funds? Or was the vicar's fear a sign of deeper involvement? She sat at her table, the ledger open once more, and began to write. She listed every discrepancy, every initial, every event, her pencil moving with the precision of a surgeon. The pattern was there, clear as day. The thefts were tied to moments of chaos, when the village was distracted by celebration or charity. The mastermind had used the village's goodness against it, a betrayal that cut deep. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes narrowing. She thought of her old friend, Miss Harton, whose sharp tongue had once unmasked a thief at a bridge game simply by noticing a hesitation in his bid. Hesitation she knew was the betrayer's weakness. Mr. Harrow's smooth answers, Mrs. Price's careful handling of cash, Mr. Clements's nervous glances, they all hesitated, in their own way, when pressed. She would press harder, but carefully, at the right moment. The day waned, and Miss Marple prepared for bed, her mind still turning. The ledger was hidden again, the key safe in her pocket. Tomorrow she would invite Mrs. Price for tea, probing gently, watching for that telltale hesitation. The village's peace depended on her, and she would not fail it. As she turned down the lamp, the fire's glow casting shadows on the walls, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The truth was close, and she would find it, one careful step at a time. Days that followed were a dance of subtlety, each conversation a step closer to the truth. Miss Marple visited the postmistress, Mrs. Blades, under the pretense of mailing a letter, and casually mentioned Mr. Harrow's research. Mrs. Blades, ever eager to share, remarked that he had received several letters from London, addressed to a Mr. Harris. The name struck a chord. J.H., perhaps? She filed it away, her mind turning to Mrs. Price. The treasurer was harder to pin down, her schedule filled with council duties and charity work. But Miss Marple was patient, arranging a chance meeting at the village shop, where they discussed the upcoming gala. Mrs. Price's hands trembled slightly as she counted change, a detail Miss Marple noted without comment. "Such a lot of work, managing all that money," she said lightly. "It must be a burden, keeping everything in order." Mrs. Price's smile was tight. "Oh, I manage," she said. "It's all for the village, after all." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her eyes warm but searching. "But it's so easy for things to slip, isn't it? A number here, a receipt there." Mrs. Price's hand froze just for a moment before she laughed. "You're quite right, Miss Marple, but I'm very careful." Miss Marple nodded, letting the moment pass. The hesitation was there, faint but unmistakable. She would need more than hesitation, though she needed proof. The ledger was damning, but it was not enough to unmask the mastermind. She needed to catch them in the act, to see the mask slip. The village gala was approaching, a grand affair that would draw every soul in St. Mary Mead. It was the perfect stage, Miss Marple thought, for a trap. The ledger's discrepancies were tied to such events, when cash changed hands and records were hastily kept. She would watch, wait, and let the betrayer betray themselves. She began to plan, her mind weaving a net of words and observations, her heart steady with the certainty that the truth, like the village itself, could not stay hidden forever. By the week's end, Miss Marple had gathered enough to form a theory. The ledger's secrets pointed to a scheme of careful theft, orchestrated by someone with access and cunning. Mr. Harrow's ledgers, Mrs. Price's past. The vicar's fear they were all threads, but the pattern was incomplete. The gala would be the moment of truth, when the betrayer's mask would slip and Miss Marple would be there, her eyes sharp, her mind ready. She closed the ledger, its secrets safe for now, and turned her thoughts to the gala, her plan taking shape like a stitch in her knitting, precise and unyielding. Chapter 7. The betrayer's mask slips. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy drawing-room, the soft clink of teacups filling the air as she adjusted the lace tablecloth on her small, polished oak table. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the walls of her cottage in St. Mary Mead. Her garden, visible through the window, was in full bloom, with roses nodding gently in the breeze. But her mind was far from the tranquil scene outside. The cryptic letter, the vicar's nervous demeanor, Mrs. Price's guarded handling of the parish funds, and the mysterious Mr. Harrow's arrival at the inn had woven a web of suspicion that Miss Marple was determined to untangle. Today, she had decided, was the day to test the threads of that web. She had invited a small group to her cottage for tea: Mrs. Price, the parish council treasurer; Mr. Harrow, the charming newcomer; Mr. Clements, the vicar; and Mrs. Dane, the postmistress whose knack for village gossip made her an unwitting ally in Miss Marple's quiet investigations. The gathering was ostensibly to discuss the upcoming village gala, a grand event that would raise funds for the church's restoration. But Miss Marple had other intentions. She had planned this tea party with the precision of a chess master. Each guest a piece on her board, each question a move to reveal the betrayer among them. The room was warm, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, though the summer day hardly called for it. Miss Marple preferred the ambience it created, a comforting backdrop to the subtle interrogation she was about to conduct. Her knitting lay neatly folded in a basket by her chair, a prop she often used to appear unassuming, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. She poured tea from a delicate porcelain pot, her movements deliberate, her smile serene. "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but with a hint of curiosity, "you've done such splendid work organizing the gala's finances. It must be quite a responsibility, handling all those donations." Mrs. Price, a woman in her late 40s, with tightly pinned hair and a perpetually pinched expression, shifted in her seat. Her navy dress was immaculate, but her fingers twisted the handle of her teacup a fraction too tightly. "Oh, it's nothing, really," she said, her voice a touch too bright. "Just a matter of keeping the books straight. A council trusts me, you know." "Of course they do," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling as she passed a plate of scones. "Trust is so important, isn't it? Especially in a small village like ours, where we all depend on one another." Mrs. Price's smile faltered for a moment, and Miss Marple noted the brief tightening of her lips. She turned to Mr. Harrow, who lounged in his chair with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to charming his way through life. His dark hair was neatly combed, his suit well tailored, though Miss Marple had noticed a slight fray at the cuffs, detail that suggested his polished exterior might not be as solid as it seemed. "And Mr. Harrow," Miss Marple continued, "you've been so kind to offer your help with the gala's publicity. A writer's touch must be invaluable. Have you done much work with charity events before?" Mr. Harrow's smile was dazzling, his teeth almost too perfect. "Oh, here and there," he said airily, leaning forward to take a scone. "I've always found village events fascinating. So much loyalty and community spirit. It's quite inspiring for my writing." "Loyalty," Miss Marple repeated, her tone musing. "Yes, that's the heart of it, isn't it? Loyalty to one's neighbors, to one's duties. It's what keeps a village like St. Mary Mead together." She paused, her eyes resting on Mr. Harrow's face, noting the slight flicker in his expression. As if her words had struck a nerve. Mr. Clements, the vicar, cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was a thin man, his face lined with worry, his clerical collar slightly askew. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a little strained, "the gala is a testament to our community's unity. We're all working toward the same goal." "Miss." Marple nodded, her smile encouraging. "Of course, Mr. Clements, and the church's restoration is such a worthy cause. I do hope the funds are all in order. It would be dreadful if anything were to go amiss." The vicar's hands twitched, and he reached for his tea, nearly spilling it. "Everything is quite in order," he said quickly, though his eyes darted toward Mrs. Price. Miss Marple noticed the glance, as well as Mrs. Price's sudden interest in the pattern on her saucer. Mrs. Dane, oblivious to the undercurrents, launched into a cheerful account of the gala's preparations, mentioning the bunting being sewn and the local baker's promise of an extra batch of tarts. Miss Marple listened politely, her mind cataloguing every detail, every reaction. She had learned long ago that people revealed themselves most when they thought no one was watching. As the conversation turned to the gala's program, Miss Marple steered it back to her purpose. "Mrs. Price," she said, her tone as mild as ever, "I couldn't help but recall something I heard years ago. Oh, it must have been when I was visiting my nephew in London. A story about a charity fund that went astray. It caused quite a stir, didn't it? I suppose you'd know all about managing funds properly, having come from London yourself." Mrs. Price's face paled, and her teacup rattled against its saucer. I don't recall anything like that," she stammered, her eyes fixed on the table. "London's full of rumors, you know. People love to gossip." "Oh, indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed, her voice soothing. "But it's so important to clear up misunderstandings, don't you think? A reputation is such a fragile thing." Mr. Harrow chuckled, though there was a slight edge to it. "You're quite the philosopher, Miss Marple," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I'm sure Mrs. Price's reputation is spotless. She's been nothing but dedicated since I arrived." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes never leaving his face. "How kind of you to say so, Mr. Harrow. And you've settled in so quickly. Tell me, have you found inspiration for your book yet? Perhaps something about trust or betrayal?" The word hung in the air, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Harrow's smile didn't waver, but Miss Marple saw the briefest tightening of his jaw, the faintest narrowing of his eyes. Mrs. Price's hand trembled as she reached for a biscuit, and a few crumbs fell onto the tablecloth. Mrs. Dane, ever oblivious, broke the silence with a laugh. "Oh, Miss Marple, you do have a way with words. Betrayal in St. Mary Mead. It sounds like one of those detective stories my niece reads." Miss Marple chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling. "Perhaps it does, Mrs. Dane, but life is often stranger than fiction, don't you think?" The conversation drifted to safer topics, flowers for the gala, the children's choir, but Miss Marple's mind was racing. She had planted her seeds, and now she watched for the harvest. Mrs. Price's discomfort was palpable, her usual composure fraying at the edges. Mr. Harrow, on the other hand, was a study in control, his charm a polished shield. But Miss Marple had seen such shields before, and she knew they often hid the most. As she poured another round of tea, a small mishap occurred. Mr. Harrow, reaching for the sugar, knocked over his teacup. The liquid spilled across the tablecloth, and as he fumbled to right it, a folded piece of paper slipped from his pocket, landing on the floor. Miss Marple, with her usual unobtrusive grace, bent to retrieve it, her fingers brushing the paper before Mr. Harrow could snatch it back. "Oh, do let me," she said, her voice all innocence as she handed it to him. But her quick glance had been enough. The paper bore a series of numbers and letters, written in a precise hand, eerily similar to the coded receipt she had found in the Fates donation box. It was not identical, but the style, the sharp angles of the numerals, the flourish of the letters was unmistakable. Mr. Harrow's smile was tight as he tucked the paper back into his pocket. "Clumsy of me," he said, his tone light but his eyes wary. "Just some notes for my book." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her expression serene. "Writers must keep their ideas close, mustn't they?" The tea party continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Mrs. Price excused herself early, claiming a headache, her face pale as she hurried out. Mr. Clements lingered, his eyes darting between Miss Marple and Mr. Harrow. as if he sensed the undercurrents but couldn't quite grasp them. Mrs. Dane chattered on, oblivious until she too departed, leaving Miss Marple and Mr. Harrow alone. "You have a sharp mind, Miss Marple," Mr. Harrow said, his tone casual, but his eyes searching. "I imagine you see a great deal, living in a village like this." "Oh, I do," Miss Marple replied, her smile gentle. "People are so very interesting, don't you think? The things they say, and the things they don't." Mr. Harrow laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "You're wasted in St. Mary Mead," he said, rising to leave. "You'd make a fine detective." Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm quite content here," she said. "There's always something to puzzle, out even in a quiet village." As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple sat back, her mind whirring. The coded receipt, the note in Harrow's pocket, Mrs. Price's unease, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was close to seeing the whole picture. She rose, moving to her small writing desk, where she kept a notebook hidden beneath a pile of knitting patterns. In it she jotted down her observations, the initials in the hidden ledger, the vicar's fear, Mrs. Price's London past, and now the unmistakable connection between Harrow's note and the receipt. The gala was 2 days away, and Miss Marple knew it would be the stage for her final move. She would need to be careful, precise, but she felt a quiet thrill of anticipation. The betrayer's mask was slipping, and she was determined to pull it off entirely. Over the next 2 days, Miss Marple prepared with her usual quiet efficiency. She visited the church, ostensibly to help with the gala's decorations, but in truth to confirm her suspicions about the locked ledger. She spoke with Tommy, the paper boy, who confirmed seeing Mr. Harrow near the church late at night, carrying a small satchel. She even paid a call to Mrs. Dane, who, in her chatter, mentioned a rumor about Mrs. Price receiving late-night telegrams, a detail that fit neatly into Miss Marple's growing theory. The morning of the gala dawned bright and clear, the village buzzing with excitement. Bunting fluttered from lamp-posts, and the scent of freshly baked goods filled the air. Miss Marple, dressed in her best lavender frock, moved through the crowd with her usual unobtrusive grace, her eyes sharp and her mind alert. She had arranged for a special announcement during the gala, one that would flush out the betrayer once and for all. As the afternoon wore on, the gala reached its peak. Children ran about with painted faces, the choir sang, and the donation table overflowed with contributions. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Price closely, noting her nervous glances toward Mr. Harrow, who stood near the refreshment tent, charming a group of villagers. The vicar, looking more haggard than ever, hovered near the donation table, his hands clasped tightly. At precisely 3 o'clock, Miss Marple took the small stage, her frail figure commanding attention with its quiet authority. "My dear friends," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I have an announcement to make. It seems there has been a mistake with the donations. A rather large sum appears to be missing." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Price's face drained of color, and she gripped the edge of the donation table. Mr. Harrow's smile froze, his eyes darting toward the exit. Miss Marple continued, her tone calm but firm. "I'm sure it's a simple error, but we must be thorough. Loyalty to our village demands it." Mrs. Price's composure cracked. "It's not true," she cried, her voice shrill. "I've done nothing wrong. If anyone's to blame, it's him." She pointed at Mr. Harrow, her hand trembling. The crowd gasped, and Mr. Harrow's charm vanished. "That's absurd," he said, his voice sharp. "I'm merely a guest here. I've no access to the funds." Miss Marple watched them both, her eyes keen. She had expected this, had counted on it. The accusation, the denial, the crack in their alliance. She stepped forward, her voice gentle but unyielding. "Perhaps we should check the donation box now," she suggested, "to put everyone's minds at ease." The vicar, looking as if he might faint, nodded. The crowd gathered closer as Miss Marple, with deliberate care, opened the donation box. Inside, among the coins and notes, was a small envelope, identical to the one she had found in Harrow's pocket. She held it up, her expression serene. "This was found among the donations," she said. "It seems to contain a rather curious note." Mr. Harrow's face tightened, and he took a step back. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, noting the slight hitch in his breath, the same nervous pattern she had heard in the churchyard during the midnight meeting. It was a small thing, but to Miss Marple it was as clear as a confession. Before anyone could stop him, Mr. Harrow turned and slipped through the crowd, heading for the gala's entrance. But Miss Marple had anticipated this, too. She had asked young Tommy to keep watch, and the boy, eager to help, had alerted the local constable, who now stood at the gate. Harrow's escape was cut short, and he was led back to the gala, his charm replaced by a scowl. Mrs. Price, meanwhile, had collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "He said it was just a small thing alone, he called it." Miss Marple sat beside her, her voice kind but firm. "Tell me everything, Mrs. Price," she said. "It's the only way to make things right." As the gala continued around them, Mrs. Price poured out her story. She had met Harrow years ago in London, during her scandal-ridden days. He had reappeared in St. Mary Mead, promising to keep her past secret if she helped him siphon funds from the parish council. She had been too afraid to refuse, and so she had doctored the ledgers, slipping small sums to Harrow under the guise of legitimate expenses. Miss Marple listened, her face impassive but her mind cataloguing every detail. When Mrs. Price finished, Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've done the right thing now," she said, "and we'll see that justice is done." She turned her attention to Mr. Harrow, who stood under the constable's watchful eye. "And you, Mr. Harrow," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority, "I believe you have some explaining to do as well." Harrow's defiance crumbled under her gaze. He admitted to orchestrating the scheme, using Mrs. Price's fear to manipulate her. The coded receipts, the hidden ledger, the late-night meetings, all were his doing. A carefully planned con to bleed the village dry. As the constable led Harrow and Mrs. Price away, Miss Marple stepped back into the crowd, her work done. The gala resumed, the villagers none the wiser about the drama that had unfolded. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her heart light but her mind already turning to the next puzzle. The envelope, still in her possession, held the final proof of Harrow's scheme, a list of transactions that would ensure his conviction. She sat by her fire that evening, her knitting in her lap, the village quiet once more. The betrayer's mask had slipped, and Miss Marple had seen it fall. It was enough for now. St. Mary Mead was safe, and she could return to her roses, her tea, and the quiet observation of human nature that was her true calling. Chapter 8. The solicitor's gambit Miss Jane Marple sat in the quiet of her cottage, the soft clink of her knitting needles punctuating the stillness of the early morning. The events of the past few days swirled in her mind like leaves caught in a gentle autumn breeze. The sapphire brooch, the missing ledger, the nervous maid, the Earl's trembling hands, and the shadowy figure in the Manor's garden, all pieces of a puzzle that refused to fully align. Yet her sharp instincts told her the solicitor, Mr. Grayson, held a key to unlocking the mystery. His evasive demeanor at the gala, the faint glint of something valuable in his office safe during a casual village errand, and his connection to the Earl's financial woes pointed to a man playing a dangerous game. Today she resolved to confront him, not with accusations, but with the subtle guile that had so often unraveled the tightest knots of deceit in St. Mary Mead. The morning was crisp, with a faint mist clinging to the hedgerows as Miss Marple made her way to the village square. Her destination was Mr. Grayson's modest office, tucked between the baker's shop and the post office, its unassuming facade belying the secrets it might hold. She carried a small basket of apples, a pretext for her visit, claiming they were a gift from her garden to discuss a minor matter of estate law. Her true purpose, however, was to probe the solicitor's role in the brooch's disappearance and the ledger's concealment. She had no illusions about Mr. Grayson's cunning. He was a man accustomed to navigating the murky waters of high society's financial entanglements. But Miss Marple knew that even the cleverest minds could falter under the weight of their own overconfidence. The office door creaked as she entered, the bell above jingling faintly. The room was dimly lit, with shelves of leather-bound ledgers and a heavy oak desk dominating the space. Mr. Grayson, a wiry man with sharp features and a perpetual air of impatience, looked up from his papers. His spectacles glinted in the light of a single lamp, giving his eyes a guarded, almost predatory quality. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone polite but tinged with wariness, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Oh, Mr. Grayson, I hope I'm not intruding," she replied, her voice light and disarming. She set the basket of apples on his desk, her eyes briefly scanning the room. A heavy safe stood in the corner, its door slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of something that caught the light as sapphire. Perhaps? She filed the observation away, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "I've been meaning to ask about a small matter concerning my late cousin's estate. Nothing urgent, of course, but I thought you might clarify a point or two." Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Of course, Miss Marple, I'm happy to assist. Though I must say, estate matters can be dreadfully dull. Not much excitement in them, I'm afraid." His smile was thin, and Miss Marple noted the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. A man hiding something, she thought, but she kept her face serene. "Oh, I quite agree," she said, settling into the chair opposite him. "Though I find the smallest details can sometimes be the most revealing. Like in gardening, you know how a single weed can hint at the state of the soil." She paused, letting the words linger, her eyes meeting his for a fraction longer than necessary. "Take that dreadful business at the gala, for instance. Such a fuss over a brooch, and yet it's the little things like a smudge of rouge or a torn page that make one wonder." Grayson's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "The brooch, yes. A terrible loss for Mrs. Clement. The constable's been quite thorough, I hear." though I doubt they'll find much. Thieves are clever these days." He shuffled some papers, his movements a touch too deliberate. Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone as gentle as ever. "Clever, indeed, but not always as clever as they think. I was chatting with Mrs. Harrow the other day. She's so proud of her roses, you know, and she mentioned something curious about a ledger. Something about the manor's finances, I believe. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, being so close to the Earl's affairs?" The solicitor's fingers paused on the papers, and Miss Marple caught the briefest flicker of unease in his eyes. "A ledger? I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. My work with the Earl is strictly confidential. You understand." His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, like a blade hidden in silk. "Of course, confidentiality is so important," she agreed, her eyes drifting to the safe. "Though it's odd, isn't it, how things go missing in such a small village? Rotes, ledgers, even trust. I once knew a young man in St. Mary Mead who thought he could outsmart everyone. He hid a stolen watch in his employer's attic, thinking no one would look there. But attics, like safes, have a way of betraying their secrets." Grayson's face tightened, and Miss Marple knew she had struck a nerve. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You see, Mr. Grayson, I've always found that people underestimate the obvious. A safe, for instance. So secure, yet so tempting. One might think it's the perfect place to hide something valuable or incriminating." The solicitor's composure cracked, his hand twitching toward the safe before he caught himself. "Miss Marple, I'm a busy man," he said, his tone clipped. "If you've no specific questions about your cousin's estate, I really must get back to work." "Oh, but I do have one question," she said, her eyes bright with feigned innocence. "It's about a hypothetical situation, you understand. If someone were to, say, borrow something valuable like a brooch to settle a debt, would they need to keep it in a safe? Or might they pass it along to someone else, perhaps someone who attended the gala?" Grayson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd. I won't be interrogated in my own office by a bye. He stopped, catching himself, but Miss Marple's serene smile never wavered. "A nosy old spinster?" she supplied helpfully. "Oh, I quite understand, Mr. Grayson. But you see, I've found that the truth has a way of slipping out like a flower blooming in the wrong season. And I couldn't help but notice when I passed by your office last week a rather lovely glint in that safe of yours. Almost like a sapphire, I'd say." The color drained from Grayson's face, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might bolt. Instead, he sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping. "You're mistaken, Miss Marple," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I have no idea what you're talking about." She rose, smoothing her skirt, her basket of apples still untouched on his desk. "Of course, Mr. Grayson, I'm sure it's nothing. But do be careful. Safes can be such unreliable things, and the constable's been so eager for a breakthrough. I'd hate for him to misunderstand." She paused at the door, turning back with a final, disarming smile. "Thank you for your time. I'll let you know if I have any more questions about my cousin's estate." As she stepped into the sunlight, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Grayson's reaction had confirmed her suspicions. He was deeply entangled in the brooch's disappearance, and the safe held more than just legal documents. But she needed more than a hunch to bring the matter to a close. The solicitor's arrogance had betrayed him, but he was not the sort to confess easily. She would need to push him further to make him believe the net was closing. Her next stop was the vicarage, where she knew the constable, Mr. Pock, would be taking his midday tea with the vicar. Pock was a good man, earnest but easily overwhelmed by the complexities of high society. Miss Marple had no intention of accusing Grayson outright. That would be far too crude. Instead, she would plant a seed, a gentle nudge to ensure the constable's attention turned toward the solicitor's office. The vicarage was a cozy haven, its parlor filled with the scent of freshly baked scones. Mrs. Clement, still shaken by the loss of her brooch, was absent, but the vicar welcomed Miss Marple warmly. Pock, his uniform slightly rumpled, looked up from his tea with a weary expression. "Miss Marple," he said, "I suppose you've heard the latest? We're no closer to finding that brooch. It's like it vanished into thin air." "Oh, I'm sure it's closer than you think," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup of tea. "Things have a way of turning up in the most unexpected places. Why, I was just at Mr. Grayson's office, discussing a small matter, and I couldn't help but notice how cluttered his safe seemed. Papers, of course, but also something that caught the light. I'm sure it's nothing, but it made me wonder." Pock's eyes narrowed, and Miss Marple knew her words had found their mark. "Grayson, you say? He's been cooperative. What, a safe, you say?" He scratched his chin, his mind clearly turning over the possibility. The vicar chuckled. "Jane, you've a knack for noticing things. But surely you don't think Mr. Grayson's involved? He's been the Earl's solicitor for years." "People can surprise you," Miss Marple said lightly. "Even the most respectable ones. I once knew a churchwarden who kept a stolen silver candlestick in his attic. He thought no one would suspect him because of his position. But positions like safes can hide all sorts of secrets." Pock set down his cup, his expression more focused now. "I might have a word with Grayson. Just to be thorough, you understand. Can't hurt to check." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes twinkling. "A very wise decision, Mr. Pock. Thoroughness is so important in these matters." As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting closer together. Grayson's safe was the key, but she suspected he was not working alone. The brooch's swap at the gala, the ledger's torn page, the maid's nervous glance all pointed to a network of deceit, with Grayson at its heart, but not its head. She needed to return to the manor, to revisit the scene of the crime and confirm her suspicions about the brooch's hiding place. The gala's floral centerpiece had been nagging at her memory, its elaborate design a perfect cover for something small and valuable. The manor was quiet when she arrived. Lady Harrow busy with preparations for an upcoming garden party. Miss Marple, under the guise of offering advice on the rose garden, slipped into the ballroom where the gala had been held. The centerpiece, a towering arrangement of roses and lilies, still stood on the main table, its vase a heavy, ornate piece of crystal. She ran her fingers along its base, feeling for anything unusual. There, beneath a decorative rim, was a faint seam, a hidden compartment, perhaps. She glanced around, ensuring she was alone, then pressed gently. A small panel clicked open, revealing a hollow space just large enough to hold a brooch. But it was empty. Miss Marple's lips pursed in thought. The brooch had been here, she was certain, but someone had moved it. The maid, perhaps, or someone else who knew the vase's secret. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Lady Harrow appeared, her face a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here. Are you still admiring the roses?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, closing the panel with a deft movement. "And your lovely centerpiece. Such craftsmanship. It almost seems designed to hold secrets, doesn't it?" Lady Harrow laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Secrets? Oh, Jane, you do have an imagination. It's just a vase, I assure you." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "Just a vase." As she made her way back to her cottage, Miss Marple's mind raced. The empty compartment confirmed her theory. The brooch had been hidden during the gala, likely by the maid under someone's orders, and then moved when the search intensified. Grayson's safe was the logical place, but she needed proof and a way to force his hand. She decided to write an anonymous note to Pauk, suggesting a search of the solicitor's office. It was a risk, but a calculated one. Grayson's arrogance would be his undoing, and she was determined to be there when it happened. That evening, she penned the note in a careful, nondescript hand. "Dear Mr. Pauk, you might find it worthwhile to examine Mr. Grayson's safe. Something valuable may be hidden there. A concerned friend." She slipped it into the post-box under cover of darkness, her heart steady with the certainty of her plan. The next morning the village buzzed with news. Pauk had obtained a warrant to search Grayson's office. Miss Marple, feigning surprise, joined the small crowd outside the solicitor's door as Pauk and his deputy entered. Grayson's protests were loud, his face flushed with indignation, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. When Pauk emerged, holding a small velvet pouch, the crowd gasped. Inside was the sapphire brooch, its intricate clasp unmistakable. Grayson's composure shattered. "It's not what you think," he shouted. "I was holding it for a client. I had no choice." Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, watched as Pauk led Grayson away. She felt a quiet satisfaction, but the puzzle was not yet complete. The brooch was recovered, but the ledger's secrets and the blackmailer's identity remained. She suspected the maid knew more than she'd let on, and the vase's empty compartment suggested another player in the game. As she walked home, her mind already turning to the next step, she allowed herself a small smile. The solicitor's gambit had failed, but the true mastermind was still at large, and Miss Marple was determined to find them. Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The brooch was safe, but the ledger's torn page and Clara's blackmail letter pointed to a deeper conspiracy. She recalled the Earl's ink-stained hands, the professor's locked drawer, and the journalist's cloaked figure. Each was a thread in the tapestry, and she would pull them one by one until the full picture emerged. For now she was content to let Pauk take the credit, her role unnoticed by the village. St. Mary Mead would sleep soundly tonight, but Miss Marple's sharp mind was already at work, ready to unravel the next layer of deceit. The day passed quietly, with Miss Marple tending to her garden and exchanging pleasantries with neighbors. But her thoughts never strayed far from the manor, the gala, and the secrets hidden in plain sight. She revisited her notes, a small notebook filled with neat handwriting, each observation a stepping stone toward the truth. The maid's nervous. Glance, the chipped lockpick, the torn ledger page, all were clues, but none pointed directly to the mastermind. She needed to return to the manor, to speak with the maid and examine the study once more. The following morning she called on Lady Harrow again, this time with a basket of scones as her excuse. The manor was abuzz with preparations for the garden party, servants bustling about with trays and decorations. Miss Marple found the maid, Ellen, polishing silver in the dining room. The girl's hands trembled slightly, and Miss Marple noted the same nervous glance she'd seen at the gala. "Ellen, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, setting the scones on the table. "You've been working so hard. It must have been quite a night at the gala, with all those grand people." Ellen's eyes darted to the door, then back to Miss Marple. "It was, ma'am. A lot of fuss, and then the brooch going missing. I didn't see nothing, I swear." Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle. "Of course, dear. But you know, I've always found that servants see more than anyone else. Little things like a guest lingering near the centerpiece or someone slipping into the study. You wouldn't have noticed anything like that, would you?" Ellen's hands froze on the silver, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. I don't know, ma'am. I was busy serving. But I did see Mr. Grayson near the centerpiece, talking to someone in a cloak. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think nothing of it." "A cloak, you say?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, encouraging. "How interesting. And did you see where they went?" Ellen hesitated, then whispered, "Toward the study, ma'am. But I didn't follow. I was too scared." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've done the right thing telling me. Don't worry, dear. I'll make sure no one bothers you." As she left the manor, Miss Marple's mind raced. Grayson and a cloaked figure, likely the journalist, Mr. Finch, or perhaps someone else entirely. The study was the key, with its locked box and missing ledger. She needed to examine it again, but discreetly. Lady Harrow's garden party would provide the perfect opportunity. With the manor full of distractions, the party was a grand affair, with villagers and gentry mingling under colorful tents. Miss Marple, dressed in her best hat, moved through the crowd, her eyes scanning for familiar faces. She spotted Clara, the heiress, looking radiant but tense, and Professor Vale, the reclusive scholar, hovering near the edge of the gathering. The Earl was absent, likely nursing his wounded pride. After Grayson's arrest, Miss Marple made her way to the study, slipping inside while the guests were distracted by a string quartet. The room was as she remembered it: heavy curtains, a mahogany desk, and the locked box she'd noted earlier. Using a hairpin, she deftly opened the box, revealing a bundle of papers. Among them was the complete ledger, its pages detailing the Earl's fraudulent dealings with his late brother. Tucked inside was Clara's blackmail letter, its contents explosive enough to ruin her reputation. Miss Marple slipped the letter into her pocket, leaving the ledger for Pop to find. She had no desire to expose Clara's secret. The poor girl had suffered enough dot as she closed the box. She heard a creak behind her. Turning, she saw Professor Vale in the doorway, his face pale. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here?" "Oh, Professor," she said, her voice calm. "I was just admiring the desk. Such fine craftsmanship. But I couldn't help noticing this box. It seems to hold quite a few secrets, doesn't it?" Vale's eyes darted to the box, then back to her. "I don't know what you mean. I was just looking for a book." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "But you know, Professor, I've always found that secrets have a way of coming to light, like that brooch you bought from the Earl. Such a pity it ended up in Mr. Grayson's safe." Veils. Shoulders slumped, and Miss Marple knew she had him. "I didn't steal it," he whispered. "I bought it fair and square. But Grayson, he said he'd handle the sale, that it would clear the Earl's debts. I didn't know he'd hide it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I believe you, Professor, but you might want to tell Mr. Pauk everything. It's the best way to clear your name." Chapter 8. The trap at the gala. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village green where the annual gala was in full swing. Bunting fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the air hummed with laughter, the clink of teacups, and the occasional burst of music from a small brass band stationed near the vicarage. Stalls lined the green, offering homemade jams, knitted scarves, and cakes piled high with icing. Children darted between tables, their faces sticky with toffee, while adults mingled, exchanging gossip and pleasantries. To an outsider it was the picture of rural harmony, but Miss Marple, seated at a small wrought-iron table near the tea tent, saw beneath the surface. Her sharp eyes, half hidden behind a delicate china cup, scanned the crowd with purpose. Today was no ordinary gala. It was the stage for her carefully laid trap. She adjusted her shawl, her fingers brushing the soft wool as she observed the key players in her unfolding drama. Mrs. Price, the parish council treasurer, stood at the donation stall, her smile tight as she counted coins with meticulous care. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly, but a faint flush on her cheeks betrayed her. Nerves. Nearby, Mr. Harrow, the charming newcomer who claimed to be a writer, leaned against a stall, chatting with the vicar, Mr. Clements. Harrow's tailored jacket and polished shoes stood out among the villagers' more modest attire, and his easy laughter carried across the green. Yet Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flickered toward Mrs. Price, a glance too quick, too deliberate. The gala had been the talk of St. Mary Mead for weeks, a chance for the village to come together and raise funds for the church roof. Miss Marple had suggested a special donation drive, a grand gesture to encourage generosity. She'd proposed announcing a fictitious large donation, £500, a sum grand enough to stir excitement but believable enough to avoid suspicion. The council had agreed, unaware of her true intent, to flush out the betrayer, the sly fox who had been siphoning funds from the parish. The announcement was her bait, and she was certain it would provoke a reaction from either Mrs. Price or Mr. Harrow, or both. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind tracing the threads of her investigation. The cryptic letter that had arrived weeks. Ago had set her on this path, its words, "Bear the sly fox among you," etched in her memory. The ledger discrepancies, the vicar's nervous behavior, Mrs. Price's hidden past, and Harrow's suspicious arrival had all pointed to a scheme. The coded receipt from the fete, the midnight meeting in the churchyard, and the locked ledgers. Secrets had confirmed it. Now at the gala she would tighten the noose. The band struck up a lively tune, and the crowd gathered near a wooden platform where Mr. Clements stood, ready to address the village. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and made her way closer, positioning herself where she could see both Mrs. Price and Mr. Harrow. The vicar cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting with a crumpled note card. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying over the chatter, "I'm delighted to share wonderful news. Thanks to your generosity, we've received a remarkable donation of £500 toward the church roof fund. But I must add we've discovered a small issue. A portion of this sum appears to be unaccounted for." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Price closely. The treasurer's hand froze mid-motion, a coin slipping from her fingers to clatter on the table. Her eyes widened, and she shot a glance at Mr. Harrow, who stood rigid, his smile faltering. The trap was sprung. Unaccounted for? Mrs. Price's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and unsteady. "That's impossible. I've handled every penny myself." The crowd turned to her, their whispers growing. Miss Marple noted the tremor in Mrs. Price's hands as she gripped the edge of the stall. Harrow stepped forward, his charm returning, like a mask slipping into place. Now, Mrs. Price," he said smoothly, "I'm sure it's a simple clerical error. No need to worry the good people of St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild, but her mind racing. Harrow's quick defense of Mrs. Price was telling, but so was the flash of anger in her eyes as she turned to him. "Don't patronize me, Mr. Harrow," she snapped, her voice louder than intended. "If anyone's to blame, it's not me. Perhaps you'd care to explain where you were last night, poking about the church." The crowd gasped, and Miss Marple's lips twitched with the faintest smile. The crack in their alliance was widening, just as she'd hoped. She stepped forward, her voice gentle but clear. "Dear me," she said, "this is most distressing. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. Mr. Clements, might we use the vicarage for a moment?" The vicar, flustered, nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. Right this way." As the crowd dispersed, whispering furiously, Miss Marple led the way to the vicarage, her steps measured but purposeful. Mrs. Price and Mr. Harrow followed, their faces a study in contrast, her pale and tense, him outwardly calm but with a tightness around his eyes. Mr. Clements trailed behind, muttering about misunderstandings. Once inside the vicarage's small parlor, Miss Marple closed the door and turned to face them. "Now," she said, her tone as mild as if she were discussing the weather, "let's get to the bottom of this. Mrs. Price, you seem quite certain. The accounts are in order, yet I couldn't help but notice, at the fete, you slipped a note into your pocket. A receipt, perhaps?" Mrs. Price's flush deepened. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I handle dozens of receipts. It's my job." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "And Mr. Harrow, you've been so helpful with the gala preparations. But I wonder why a writer researching village life would need so many ledgers in his room at the inn. Quite a collection, I hear." Harrow's smile tightened. "I'm thorough, Miss Marple. Research requires detail." "Indeed," she said. "But let's return to this missing donation. If it's a mistake, as you suggest, Mr. Harrow, perhaps we should check the donation box again. I noticed you were near it earlier, adjusting the decorations." Harrow's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Mrs. Price burst out, "He's the one you should be questioning. He's been asking about the council's funds since he arrived. I saw him near the church last night, sneaking about." "Enough, Margaret." Harrow's voice was sharp, his charm slipping. "You're hardly blameless. Who's been skimming from the fate donations, eh? Don't think I haven't noticed." The room fell silent, the accusation hanging in the air. Mr. Clements looked horrified, his hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple, however, remained serene, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Goodness," she said softly, "it seems there's much to untangle. But let's not jump to conclusions. Mr. Harrow, I believe you were seen leaving the gala briefly, just before the donation announcement. Perhaps you needed to retrieve something." Harrow's jaw tightened, and Miss Marple's eyes flicked to his coat pocket, where a faint bulge suggested something hidden. She rose, moving toward the tea tray, as if to pour another cup, but her path took her closer to Harrow. As she passed, she stumbled deliberately, though no one would guess. It and her hand brushed his coat. A small envelope fell to the floor. "Oh, dear me," she said, bending to retrieve it. "How clumsy of me." Harrow lunged forward, but Miss Marple was quicker, holding the envelope just out of reach. "What's this?" she asked, her voice innocent. A letter, perhaps, or something more? The room seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Price stared at the envelope, her face ashen. Harrow's composure cracked, his hands clenching into fists. Mr. Clements stammered, "Miss Marple, perhaps we should—" "No need, Mr. Clements," she said, her tone firm. "I believe this envelope may hold the answers we need. Shall we open it?" She held Harrow's gaze, her eyes steady and unrelenting. For a moment no one moved. Then, with a resigned slump, Harrow sank back into his chair. "It's nothing," he muttered. "Just personal papers." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "We'll see." She slipped the envelope into her handbag, her movements calm but deliberate. "I think we've had enough excitement for one afternoon. Mrs. Price, Mr. Harrow, I suggest you both remain in the village until this matter is resolved. Mr. Clements, perhaps you could ensure the donation box is secured." The vicar nodded, still dazed. Mrs. Price and Harrow exchanged a glance, their mutual distrust palpable. Miss Marple excused herself, stepping back into the fading light of the gala. The band played on, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the vicarage. She clutched her handbag, the envelope safe inside. Its contents a mystery she was eager to unravel as she walked back to her cottage. The village green buzzing behind her, Miss Marple's mind was already at work. The envelope was the key, she was certain. It held the proof she needed to unmask the betrayer or betrayers. The gala had played its part, exposing the cracks in their alliance. Now she needed only to open the envelope and confront the truth it held. Back at her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting untouched. The envelope lay on the table, its edges slightly worn. She hesitated, savoring the moment. The gala had been a triumph, but the real victory lay ahead. With a steady hand she reached for the envelope, ready to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. The village of St. Mary Mead slept peacefully that night, unaware of the drama that had unfolded. But Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew the truth was close. The trap had been set, the players had faltered, and soon the sly fox would be caught. Chapter 9. The breath of truth. Miss Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock filling the silence. The envelope lay on the polished mahogany table before her, its edges slightly worn, as if it had been handled with care or perhaps with guilt. Outside St. Mary Mead lay under a blanket of early autumn mist, the village quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a sparrow or the distant clatter of a milk cart. The stillness suited her mood. It was a time for thinking, for piecing together the final threads of a puzzle that had begun with a cryptic letter and now teetered on the edge of revelation. She adjusted her spectacles, her fingers steady despite the weight of what she held. The envelope, retrieved from Mr. Harrow's hasty attempt to conceal it at the gala, was no ordinary piece of mail. Its contents, she suspected, would confirm the suspicions that had grown like ivy in her mind, persistent, clinging, and impossible to ignore. With a gentle tug, she opened the flap, revealing a small stack of papers, a series of letters, receipts, and a single photograph, all meticulously folded. The photograph caught her eye first, a grainy image of a younger Mrs. Price, standing beside a man who bore a striking resemblance to Mr. Harrow, though his hair was darker and his frame slighter. They were in a city, London perhaps, judging by the blurred backdrop of a busy street. The man's arm was around Mrs. Price's shoulder, and her smile was one of trust, even adoration. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Trust, she knew, was a fragile thing, easily exploited by a sly fox. She set the photograph aside and turned to the letters. The first was written in a bold, looping hand, signed with the initials J.H. Jonathan Harrow, no doubt. It was addressed to Mrs. Price, dated 3 years prior, and spoke of a shared venture that promised mutual prosperity. The tone was warm, almost intimate, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the undercurrent of manipulation. Words, like discretion and opportunity, were peppered throughout, hinting at a scheme that required secrecy. The second letter, dated only a month ago, was curt, almost threatening. "Eleanor, the time for hesitation is over. The funds must be secured by the gala, or we both stand to lose everything." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Eleanor Price, the treasurer, had been drawn into something far deeper than she'd likely intended. The receipts were next, a series of transactions marked with cryptic notations. They detailed sums of money small at first, then growing larger transferred to an account under a name Miss Marple didn't recognize, H.J. Langley. The amounts corresponded with the discrepancies she'd found in the church's hidden ledger, funds siphoned from charity drives and village events. One receipt, however, stood out. It was for a payment made to a private investigator in London, dated just before Mr. Harrow's arrival in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the paper. The private investigator suggested someone was being watched, or perhaps someone was covering their tracks. She leaned back in her chair, her mind weaving the clues together. Mr. Harrow, or whatever his true name was, had a history with Mrs. Price, one that stretched back to her scandal-ridden days in London. The photograph suggested a personal connection, the letters a professional one, and the receipts a criminal one. But it was Harrow's role as the orchestrator that intrigued her most. His charm, his polished manners, his carefully crafted persona. As a writer, all were tools to mask his true purpose. And Mrs. Price, with her nervous glances and guarded demeanor, had been his unwitting accomplice, drawn in by promises of wealth or perhaps something more personal that Miss Marple knew she needed to act, but confrontation required precision. She couldn't simply accuse them outright. The village would erupt in gossip, and the truth might slip through the cracks of scandal. No, she needed them to reveal themselves, to let their own fears and guilt unravel the scheme. She decided, to speak with Mrs. Price first, alone, where the woman's defenses might be lower. Harrow, she suspected, would be harder to crack. His confidence bordered on arrogance, and he'd likely deflect any direct challenge. But Miss Marple had faced such types before. A single well-placed observation could pierce even the thickest. Armored dot the next morning, Miss Marple walked to Mrs. Price's modest cottage at the edge of the village. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. She carried a basket of apples from her garden, a pretext for the visit. Mrs. Price answered the door, her face pale and her eyes shadowed, as if sleep had eluded her. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight. "What a surprise." "I thought you might enjoy some apples," Miss Marple said with a warm smile, stepping inside. The sitting-room was tidy but tense, with a faint air of disarray, a misplaced cushion, a teacup left unwashed on the table. Mrs. Price offered tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. They sat, and Miss Marple began with gentle pleasantries, speaking of the gala and the village's charm. But her eyes never left Mrs. Price's face, noting the way her fingers clutched the teacup, the way her gaze darted to the window, as if expecting someone. "You've done so much for the parish council, Eleanor," Miss Marple said softly. "It must be a heavy responsibility, handling all those funds." Mrs. Price's cup rattled against its saucer. "It's manageable," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly concern. "But it must weigh on you, knowing how much trust the village places in you, and how easily that trust can be misplaced." She let the word hang in the air, watching as Mrs. Price's face drained of color. I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Price stammered, but her eyes betrayed her. They flickered to a small desk in the corner, where a locked box sat half hidden beneath a shawl. Miss Marple pressed gently, her voice calm but firm. "Eleanor, I've seen things in my time, small things like a coded receipt or a hidden ledger that tell a story. And I've seen how guilt can eat away at someone, even someone who didn't mean to stray so far." She paused, letting the silence work its own pressure. "You were in London years ago, weren't you, before you came here?" Difficult time, I imagine." Mrs. Price's breath hitched, and her hands flew to her face. "How did you—" She stopped, her voice breaking. It was supposed to be different this time. He promised it would be clean, that no one would get hurt. He, Miss Marple, asked, though she already knew the answer. "Jonathan?" Mrs. Price whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and relief. "Mr. Harrow. He said we could start over, that the money would help us both. I didn't want to, not at first, but he knew things about me, about London. He said he'd tell everyone if I didn't help." Miss Marple nodded, her face a mask of sympathy, though her mind was racing. Blackmail, then? Harrow had used Mrs. Price's past to manipulate her, turning her into a pawn in his scheme. "And the funds?" she asked gently. "The charity money?" Mrs. Price's shoulders slumped, and the confession poured out like water from a cracked dam. She admitted to skimming small amounts from the church's donations, always under Harrow's direction. He'd provided the coded receipts, instructed her on which sums to divert, and promised her a share of the profits. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to be free of him." Miss Marple reached out, patting her hand. "You've taken the first step, Eleanor. Telling the truth is never easy, but it's the only way to make things right." She stood, her mind already turning to Harrow. Mrs. Price's confession was a start, but the true orchestrator remained untouched. That afternoon, Miss Marple found Mr. Harrow at the inn, lounging in the garden with a book he clearly wasn't reading. His smile was as polished as ever, but there was a tightness around his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Miss Marple," he said, rising to greet her, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" She smiled, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. "I was passing by and thought we might chat. You've been so interested in our little village, and I've been curious about you." She sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and began with small talk his supposed writing project, the charm of St. Mary Mead. But she watched him closely, noting the way his fingers tapped against the table, the way his breath came in short, controlled bursts when she mentioned the gala. "You left rather quickly last night," she said casually, her eyes fixed on his. "I hope nothing was amiss." Harrow's smile faltered, just for a moment. "Oh, just a headache," he said, waving a hand. "Crowds can be overwhelming." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied. But her next words were sharp, like a needle slipping through fabric. "It's strange, isn't it, how small things can betray us? A dropped handkerchief, a coded note, a nervous breath in the dark." She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but piercing. "I heard someone in the churchyard a few nights ago, Mr. Harrow, someone discussing a plan, a deadline. Their breathing was quite distinctive, quick, almost panicked. Much like yours just now." Harrow froze, his hand halfway to his glass. For a moment he said nothing, and Miss Marple saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options. Then he laughed, a forced sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You have quite the imagination, Miss Marple. I'm just a writer, not some conspirator." But Miss Marple was relentless, her voice steady as she laid out the evidence, the letters, the receipts, the photograph linking him to Mrs. Price's past. She didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse. She simply presented the facts, each one a stone in a wall closing around him. "You've been very clever, Mr. Harrow, or should I say Mr. Langley? But even the cleverest fox leaves tracks." Harrow's facade crumbled, his breath coming in the same quick, shallow pattern she'd heard in the churchyard. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I don't need to prove it to the village," Miss Marple said quietly. "Mrs. Price has already told me enough, and I suspect the authorities in London would be very interested in your activities here and in your past." The mention of London was the final blow. Harrow's shoulders sagged, and he ran a hand through his hair, his charm replaced by a weary resignation. "It was just money," he muttered. "No one was supposed to get hurt." Miss Marple said nothing, letting his confession fill the silence. He admitted to orchestrating the scheme, using Mrs. Price's fear of exposure to manipulate her. The funds, he said, were meant to pay off debts from his own failed ventures in London, debts that had driven him to St. Mary Mead in search of easy money. "I thought a small village would be simple," he said bitterly. "I didn't count on you." By evening, Miss Marple had arranged for both Mrs. Price and Mr. Harrow to meet with the village constable, a discreet man who knew better than to question her instincts. Mrs. Price, tearful but relieved, promised to repay the stolen funds. while Harrow, his charm gone, agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. The envelope's contents were handed. Over its secrets no longer a threat to the village's peace. As Miss Marple walked home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the lane. She felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that the truth had prevailed. Human nature, she reflected, was much like her garden full of beauty and thorns, often tangled in ways that required a patient hand to unravel. She paused at her gate, glancing at the roses still blooming despite the autumn chill. Tomorrow she would tend to them, but tonight she would sit by her fire, content in the knowledge that St. Mary Mead was safe once more. The story of the betrayal never spread beyond the constable's office, a fact for which Miss Marple was grateful. The village had no need for scandal, and she had no desire for recognition. As she settled into her armchair that night, a skein of wool in her lap, she thought of Harrow's nervous breath, the sound that had unmasked him. It was always the small things, she mused, that revealed the truth. A glance, a word, a breath. And with that she picked up her knitting, the soft click of needles blending with the ticking of the clock, a gentle rhythm that marked the end of another mystery. Chapter 10. The Village Restored. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat, her knitting needles clicking softly. The village of St. Mary. Mead was stirring, its rhythm restored after the whirlwind of the sapphire brooch affair. Miss Marple, with her usual composure, had invited Mrs. Clement and Clara, the heiress, for tea. The invitation was simple, written in her neat hand, but it carried the weight of resolution. She had solved the mystery, and now, with the brooch safely recovered, she intended to tie up the final threads with her characteristic discretion. The cottage was a picture of quiet, elegance. A vase of freshly cut roses sat on the sideboard, their scent mingling with the aroma of brewing tea. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle well solved. The village had been abuzz since the solicitor, Mr. Grayson, was quietly taken into custody by the local constables, who, though competent in their routine duties, had been out of their depth with the Manor's high-stakes drama. Miss Marple had ensured Grayson's arrest with an anonymous tip. A carefully worded note slipped under the station door in the dead of night. She had no desire for credit. The restoration of harmony in St. Mary Mead was reward enough. Mrs. Clement arrived first, her face still pale but soft with relief. She wore a simple gray dress, her hands fidgeting with a lace handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, stepping into the cottage, "I can hardly believe it's over. The brooch, my family's pride returned to me. I don't know how to thank you." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "My dear, a cup of tea and your company are thanks enough. Please sit." She gestured to a cushioned chair by the table, where a tray of scones and clotted cream awaited. Mrs. Clement settled in, her shoulders relaxing as Miss Marple poured. Tea from a porcelain pot, the steam curling in the morning light. Clara arrived moments later, her elegance undimmed despite the ordeal. Her silk dress rustled as she entered, her eyes wary but grateful. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "I owe you more than I can say. That letter, I thought it would ruin me." Miss Marple waved a hand dismissively, though her gaze was sharp. "Nonsense, my dear. These things have a way of sorting themselves out. Now let's have tea and put all this behind us." As the three women sat, the conversation flowed gently, touching on village matters, the upcoming flower show, the vicar's new sermon series, but Miss Marple's mind was still weaving through the events of the past weeks. She had unraveled the mystery with her usual method, quiet observation, a knack for human nature, and an unerring sense for the details others overlooked. The brooch, hidden in the gala's floral centerpiece, had been the final piece, but the path to it had been a tapestry of motives and secrets. The sapphire brooch, with its intricate clasp, had been more than a jewel. Its tiny key, cunningly concealed, had unlocked a box in the Manor's study, revealing the complete ledger in Clara's blackmail letter. The ledger detailed the fraudulent dealings of the Earl's late brother, who had siphoned funds from the Manor's estate to cover his gambling debts. The letter, penned in a moment of youthful indiscretion, had linked Clara to him, a scandal that could have tarnished her reputation. Miss Marple had chosen to keep the letter's contents private, handing it to Clara with a quiet word, "Burn it, my dear, and let the past rest." The Earl, meanwhile, had left St. Mary Mead under the pretense of a business trip, his departure hastened by the ledger's exposure. Whispers in the village suggested he was selling his London properties to settle his debts, a move Miss Marple suspected would keep him away for good. She felt no malice toward him. His confession, though laced with half-truths, had helped her confirm the brooch at the gala was a replica. His trembling hands and ink-stained fingers had pointed her to the torn ledger page, a clue that had unraveled his role in the scheme. Clara, now free from the blackmailer's grip, had surprised the village with a generous donation to the vicarage, funding repairs to the crumbling bell tower. Miss Marple had watched her at the gala, noting her nervous glances, and had sensed a good heart beneath the heiress's polished exterior. Clara's gratitude was evident as she sipped her tea, her fingers steady for the first time in weeks. "I've decided to stay in St. Mary Mead for a while," she said, her voice brighter. "The village has a charm I hadn't noticed before." Mrs. Clement nodded, her eyes misty. "It's a special place, and thanks to you, Miss Marple, it's whole again." Miss Marple demurred, her knitting needles pausing. "Oh, I did very little. People talk, you know, and secrets have a way of slipping out." Her tone was light, but her mind was sharp, replaying the moments that had led to the solution. The smudge of rouge on a guest's glove, the chipped lockpick by the study door, the maid's nervous glance, all had been threads in the tapestry. The solicitor, Mr. Grayson, had been the mastermind, using the gala's chaos to swap the replica brooch for the real one, intending to sell it to settle the Earl's debts. His boastful confession in his office, elicited by Miss Marple's feigned confusion, had been his undoing. The constables, though unaware of her role, had regained their confidence. The village buzzed with talk of their brilliant arrest. Based on the anonymous tip, Miss Marple smiled to herself, content to let them take the credit. Her satisfaction came from the quiet restoration of order, the return of the brooch to Mrs. Clement, and the protection of Clara's future. The ledger, now in the hands of a discreet magistrate, would ensure the Manor's finances were scrutinized, preventing further fraud. As the tea party drew to a close, Mrs. Clement clasped Miss Marple's hand. "You're a marvel, Jane. Truly, the village is lucky to have you." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I'm just an old woman who likes to listen, my dear." "Now, Do try the scones, they're Mrs. Bantry's recipe." Clara lingered after Mrs. Clement left, her expression thoughtful. "Miss Marple, how did you know? All those little things, how did you see them?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "People are much the same everywhere, my dear. A glance, a word, a gesture. They tell stories if you know how to read them. St. Mary Mead is no different from anywhere else." Clara smiled, a weight lifted. "I'll remember that. Thank you." As the heiress departed, Miss Marple settled. By her fire, her knitting resumed. The village was at peace, its harmony restored. The brooch rested safely with Mrs. Clement. The Earl's schemes were undone, and Clara's future was secure. The constables, though outwitted, were content with their victory, and the manor's secrets were safely buried. Miss Marple's sharp mind, ever restless, was already turning to the next puzzle, though for now she was content to knit and watch the fires glow. The afternoon faded into evening, and St. Mary Mead settled into its familiar rhythm. The vicarage bell chimed, children laughed in the lane, and the scent of roses drifted through the open window. Miss Marple, with a quiet smile, knew the village's trust was intact, its heart unbroken. She had no need for fanfare. The click of her needles and the warmth of her cottage were enough. The mystery was closed, every thread neatly tied, and St. Mary Mead was whole once more. But the village, like Miss Marple's mind, was never truly still. A new whisper, a fresh glance, a subtle shift in the air, something would stir soon enough. And when it did, she would be ready, her keen eyes and quiet wisdom, waiting to unravel the next tale. For now, though she knitted, the fire crackled, and the world was as it should be. The days that followed were soft and unhurried, the kind of days St. Mary Mead cherished. The flower show preparations were in full swing, with Mrs. Price Ridley fussing over her dahlias and young Tommy Pierce sneaking extra biscuits from the vicarage kitchen. Miss Marple, as always, was a quiet presence, her cottage a hub of gentle activity. Neighbors dropped by with small gifts, a jar of homemade jam, a cutting from a prized rose bush, unaware of the role she had played in restoring their peace. Mrs. Clement, now wearing the sapphire brooch proudly at church, had regained her spark. She spoke of organizing a new charity gala, this time with tighter security, and Miss Marple nodded approvingly, though she privately doubted the need for such measures. The village, she knew, had a way of policing itself, its secrets surfacing in the chatter of the post office or the glances at the butcher's counter. Clara, true to her word, stayed on, renting a small cottage near the green. She was seen walking with the vicar's son, a shy young man with a fondness for poetry, and Miss Marple noted the blush in Clara's cheeks with quiet amusement. The heiress was finding her place, her past no longer a shadow. The blackmail letter, reduced to ashes in Clara's fireplace, would trouble her no more. The Earl's absence was barely remarked upon. So smoothly had Miss Marple's work faded into the background. The manor, under Lady Harrow's capable hands, was being restored to its former glory, with talk of opening its gardens to the public. The ledger's revelations had prompted a discreet audit, and the manor's finances were slowly stabilizing. Miss Marple, who had passed the ledger to a trusted friend in the magistrate's office, felt no need to follow its progress further. Her part was done. The constables, meanwhile, had taken to patrolling with a new swagger, their egos bolstered by the arrest of Mr. Grayson. The solicitor, now facing charges of theft and fraud, had been sent to the county court, his boasts silenced. Miss Marple had heard through the village grapevine that he'd tried to pin the blame on the footman, Tom, but the boy's honest confusion had swayed the magistrate. Tom, chastened but relieved, had returned to his duties at the manor, his muddy boots. A lesson learned. As the weeks passed, Miss Marple's cottage remained a haven of calm. She tended her garden, her fingers deft among the roses, and welcomed visitors with her usual warmth. The village children, bold enough to knock, were rewarded with stories and peppermints, though Miss Marple's tea leaves were carefully free of her own exploits. She preferred it that way, her role as the village's quiet guardian, unspoken but deeply felt. One afternoon, as autumn crept into St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her eyes on the horizon. A letter had arrived from Professor Vale, the reclusive scholar, thanking her for the book she'd borrowed as her pretext for visiting his study. The letter was polite, but Miss Marple noted its careful phrasing, a hint of unease in the loops of his handwriting. She smiled to herself, filing the observation away. Vale had been a minor player, his lie about the brooch's sale a clumsy attempt to cover his tracks. He was no mastermind, but his nervous tic had confirmed her suspicions, and she was content to let him stew in his scholarly retreat. The journalist, Mr. Finch, had left the village shortly after their meeting at the inn, his story on the Earls' finances published in a London paper. Miss Marple had read it with interest, noting its careful omissions. Finch, she suspected, had seen more than he'd shared, but his description of the cloaked figure at the gala had been enough to point her to Grayson. She wished him well wherever his investigations took him, but hoped he'd steer clear of St. Mary Mead for a while. The village needed no more scandals. As the fire burned low, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the brooch itself. Its sapphire gleamed in her memory, a symbol of the village's resilience. The tiny key, hidden in its clasp, had unlocked more than a box. It had revealed the fragility of trust and the strength of quiet justice. She had returned the brooch to Mrs. Clement with a simple explanation, leaving out the ledger, the letter, and the tangled motives of the manor's guests. Mrs. Clement had wept with gratitude, and Miss Marple had patted her hand, her heart full. The village, too, was full of life, of gossip, of the small joys and sorrows that bound it together. Miss Marple, knitting by her fire, felt its pulse as surely as her own. She was part of St. Mary Mead, yet apart from it, her mind always a step ahead, her eyes always watching. The mystery of the sapphire brooch was solved, its threads neatly tied, but she knew others would come. A misplaced word, a shadowed glance, a secret too heavy to keep. They would find her, as they always did. And so, as the stars rose over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knitted on, her needles a steady rhythm, her mind at rest but ever ready. The village slept, its harmony restored, its trust unbroken. The brooch was home, the manor was healing, and the constables, bless them, were none the wiser. Miss Marple smiled into the firelight, content with her work, her cottage a beacon of quiet strength in a world that needed it. The seasons would turn, the village would hum, and Miss Marple would be there, watching, listening, solving. For now, though she was simply Jane, an old woman with a sharp mind and a warm heart, knitting by the fire as St. Mary Mead dreamed on. Chapter 10. The Village Restored. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of Earl Grey cooling on the side table, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet beyond her window, its familiar rhythms restored after the tumult of the past weeks. The betrayal that had threatened to unravel the community's trust had been neatly resolved, but the task of healing the subtle fractures remained. Miss Marple, ever the silent guardian, knew her work was not yet done, though the village would. Never fully grasped the extent of her quiet orchestrations, the events of the gala still lingered in her mind. The envelope, its contents a damning ledger of Harrow's schemes and Mrs. Price's complicity, had been the key to unmasking the betrayers. Harrow, revealed as Reginald Thorne, a conman with a trail of aliases stretching from London to Bristol, had crumbled under the weight of Miss Marple's gentle but unrelenting questions. Mrs. Price, driven by greed and manipulated by Thorne's promises of wealth, had confessed her part in skimming the parish funds, her tears staining the lace tablecloth at Miss Marple's tea party. The confessions had been secured, the culprits quietly handed over to the authorities in nearby Much Benham, and the village spared the scandal of a public trial. But the restoration of St. Mary Mead's harmony required more than justice. It demanded discretion, care, and a touch of artifice. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and glanced at the small parcel on her table, wrapped in plain brown paper. It contained the recovered funds, painstakingly gathered from Thorne's hidden accounts, which she had arranged to be returned to the parish council as an anonymous donation. The council, blissfully unaware of the true source, had accepted it with gratitude, attributing the windfall to a generous benefactor moved by the spirit of the gala. The vicar, Mr. Clements, had even mentioned it in his Sunday sermon, speaking of divine providence. Miss Marple had listened from her pew, her expression serene, her thoughts her own. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and stepped into her garden. The roses were in full bloom, their scent mingling with the crisp autumn air. She clipped a few faded blooms, her movements precise, her mind turning over the events that had led to this moment. The village had been shaken, not by the theft itself, petty in scale compared to the grand scandals of London, but by the betrayal of trust. The parish council, a microcosm of St. Mary Mead's social fabric, had been infiltrated by deceit, and the ripples had touched every villager, from the postmistress to the paper boy. Restoring that trust, Miss Marple knew, was a delicate task, one that required her to remain in the shadows. Her first step had been to ensure the funds were returned without fanfare. She had contacted a solicitor in London, an old friend of her, nephew Raymond, who handled such matters with discretion. The solicitor, Mr. Petherbridge, had traced Thorne's accounts through a series of coded letters Miss Marple had found in the envelope. The money, siphoned from charity drives and church collections, had been funneled into a small account in Bristol under one of Thorne's aliases. Petherbridge, with Miss Marple's guidance, had arranged for its return, crafting a narrative of an anonymous donor to shield the village from the truth. The council, delighted by the sudden influx, had promptly allocated the funds to repair the church roof and expand the village library, projects that would benefit all. Miss Marple paused, by her rose bushes, her shears glinting in the sunlight. She recalled the council meeting where the donation was announced. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, had been effusive, her voice ringing with optimism as she proposed a new reading nook for the children. Mr. Clements, his earlier nervousness, replaced by relief, had nodded enthusiastically, though his eyes occasionally darted to Miss Marple, as if sensing her unseen hand. She had smiled benignly, her knitting in her lap, and said nothing. The council's gratitude had been directed outward to an imagined benefactor, and Miss Marple preferred it that way. The village needed to believe in its own goodness, not in the machinations of a betrayer or the quiet corrections of an elderly spinster. She returned to her cottage, her thoughts shifting to the villagers themselves. Trust, once broken, was not easily mended. Whispers of the gala's drama still circulated Mrs. Price's sudden departure to visit a sick aunt in Devon, Mr. Harrow's abrupt exit from the inn, the vague rumors of financial irregularities. Miss Marple had anticipated this. Gossip in a village like St. Mary Mead was as inevitable as the seasons, but it could be shaped. She had already begun her subtle work, dropping careful words in the right ears. At the post office she had mentioned to Mrs. Blades that Mrs. Price had always been a bit overwhelmed by her duties as treasurer, suggesting exhaustion rather than malfeasance. To young Tommy, the paper boy, she had casually remarked that Mr. Harrow's departure was likely due to a pressing deadline for his book, planting the idea of a harmless eccentric rather than a criminal. These small interventions delivered. With the lightest touch, were already bearing fruit. The village's chatter was shifting from suspicion to sympathy, the narrative of betrayal fading into one of human frailty and departure. Miss Marple knew the power of a story well told. People preferred explanations that preserved their sense of order, and she was adept at providing them. By the time she sat down to her afternoon tea, the village was already settling back into its familiar rhythms, the gala's drama receding like a tide, yet her work was not entirely finished. There was the matter of Mr. Clements. The vicar, though innocent of theft, had been complicit in his silence, his fear of scandal allowing Thorne and Mrs. Price to operate unchecked. Miss Marple had no intention of exposing him. His heart was in the right place, and the village needed its vicar, but she felt a quiet conversation was in order. She invited him to tea the following day, ostensibly to discuss the church fates. Success. When he arrived, his face was still marked by the strain of recent weeks, his hands fidgeting with his teacup. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice hesitant, "I can't help but feel I've let the parish down. If I'd spoken up sooner about those discrepancies—" "Nonsense, Mr. Clements," she said gently, passing him a slice of seed cake. "You acted as you thought best. The important thing is that the parish is whole again. We mustn't dwell on what might have been." He looked at her, his eyes searching, as if sensing the weight of her words. "You've a way of seeing things clearly, Miss Marple. I don't know how you do it." She smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, I just notice things, Mr. Clements. People are much the same everywhere, you know." The conversation turned to lighter matters, the new hymnals, the children's choir. But Miss Marple had achieved her aim. The vicar left her cottage with a lighter heart, his confidence restored, ready to lead his flock without the shadow of guilt. She watched him walk down the lane, his step brisker than it had been in weeks, and felt a quiet satisfaction. The village needed its pillars, and Mr. Clements, for all his flaws, was one of them. As the days passed, Miss Marple continued her subtle ministrations. She attended the Women's Institute meeting, where she praised the council's transparency in handling the donation, quelling any lingering doubts. She visited the library, where she suggested a plaque to honor the anonymous donor, a gesture that would cement the narrative of generosity. She even took a walk with Mrs. Dane Calthrop, who had begun to suspect Miss Marple's role, but was too tactful to say so outright. Instead, she squeezed Miss Marple's arm and said, "You're a marvel, Jane. The village is lucky to have you." "Miss?" Marple demurred, her cheeks pinkening. "Oh, I'm just an old woman with too much time on her hands." But as she returned to her cottage, her heart was light. The village was healing, its trust slowly knitting back together, much like the scarf taking shape on her needles. She sat by her fire that evening, the crackle of the logs a comforting counterpoint to her thoughts. The betrayal had been a small one in the grand scheme of things, but its ripples had tested the village's resilience. That resilience, she knew, came not from grand gestures, but from the quiet, steady work of those who cared for it, people like herself. Unnoticed but ever watchful, she picked up her knitting, the wool soft under her fingers. The scarf was nearly finished, its pattern intricate but orderly, much like the village itself. She thought of Thorne, now facing justice in a distant city, and Mrs. Price, starting anew somewhere far from St. Mary Mead. She thought of the vicar, finding his courage, and the council, blissfully unaware of how close it had come to scandal. And she thought of the villagers going about their lives, their faith in one another restored. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where the lights of St. Mary Mead twinkled in the dusk. The village was serene, its harmony intact, its secret safe in her keeping. She smiled to herself, her needles clicking softly, and turned her thoughts to the next day's tasks. There would always be another puzzle, another thread to untangle, but for now her work was done. She set her knitting aside and rose to make a final cup of tea. The firelight danced on the walls, casting shadows that seemed to nod in approval. St. Mary Mead was at peace, and Miss Marple, its quiet guardian, was content.